Topic: the Wealth Thermostat. There is something inside you that already knows how much money you are supposed to have, and no matter what happens to you financially, you will drift back toward that number like a thermostat returning a room to its set temperature. You can win the lottery. You can receive an inheritance. You can stumble into a windfall that should change everything. And within a few years, sometimes within months, you will find yourself right back where you started. Not because of bad luck, not because of external circumstances, but because something deep in your psychology is working constantly, invisibly, to return you to the financial temperature you believe you deserve. This is the wealth thermostat, and understanding it might be the most important thing you ever learn about money. Because until you change the setting, all the strategies and tips and investment advice in the world will simply bounce off you like water off stone. The thermostat was set early, probably before you could even count money. Your parents spoke about finances in certain ways around you, or perhaps they never spoke about them at all, which communicated its own powerful message. You absorb beliefs about what kind of person has money and what kind of person struggles about whether wealth is something that happens to people like you or something that belongs to others. You watched how the adults in your life responded to financial stress, whether they became anxious or remained calm, whether they saw money as a tool or as a source of shame. And all of this programming went straight into your unconscious mind, where it formed a thermostat setting that would govern your financial life for decades to come, without you ever knowing it existed. The research on this phenomenon is remarkable. When people come into sudden money, their spending patterns shift in predictable ways that have nothing to do with rational financial planning. They begin unconsciously finding ways to return to baseline, buying things they do not need, giving money away to people who may not deserve it, making investments that seem reasonable on the surface, but carry hidden risks that part of them somehow knows will fail. You can watch this happen in real time with lottery winners, with professional athletes who sign massive contracts with people who inherit family wealth. They did not build themselves. The pattern repeats with eerie consistency because the thermostat always wins, until you learn to reset it, and resetting it is possible, but it requires something much deeper than financial education. It requires examining the beliefs you hold about yourself and your relationship to money. Beliefs that feel so natural and obvious that you have probably never questioned them. The person who believes deep down that they do not deserve wealth will find 1,000 creative ways to prevent themselves from keeping it, while the person who believes wealth is their natural state will recover from setbacks that would destroy others because their internal thermostat keeps pulling them back toward abundance. The difference between these two people is not intelligence or education or even opportunity. It is the setting on a dial they did not know they had. Money dysmorphia. Consider how strange it is that someone with $1 million in the bank can feel desperately poor, while someone earning minimum wage can feel financially secure. The objective numbers should determine how people feel about their money, but they almost never do. Instead, there is a phenomenon researchers call money dysmorphia, a kind of financial body dysmorphia, where your perception of your financial reality becomes distorted beyond recognition. You look in the financial mirror and you see something that does not match what is actually there. This distortion runs in both directions. Some people accumulate significant wealth, but cannot shake the feeling that they are one step away from poverty. They check their accounts obsessively. They worry about expenses that represent a tiny fraction of their net worth. They cannot enjoy what they have built because their perception tells them it could all vanish at any moment. These are often people who experienced financial trauma earlier in life. Perhaps they grew up in households where money was scarce or unpredictable. Or perhaps they went through a period of genuine financial crisis that left invisible scars on their psychology. The crisis passed. The numbers recovered, but the fear remained encoded in their nervous system like a soldier who still flinches at loud noises. Years after leaving the war zone on the other side are people who have very little but feel wealthy. And while this might sound like a healthier state, it carries its own dangers because it can prevent someone from taking necessary action to improve their situation. They feel fine, so why would they change anything? Their distorted perception tells them they are doing better than they are, and so they miss opportunities to build genuine security. Both versions of money dysmorphia share something in common: the disconnect between subjective experience and objective reality, between what the numbers say and what the emotions feel. And this disconnect is not a bug in human psychology. It is a feature one that evolved when money did not exist, and when our assessments of resource security were based on entirely different cues. Your ancestors did not have bank balances to check; they had food stores and territorial boundaries and social relationships, and the emotional systems that helped them assess those things still run in the background of your mind today. Trying to make sense of numbers on screens and abstract financial instruments using tools designed for a completely different world, which is why you cannot think your way out of money dysmorphia. You cannot simply tell yourself that you have enough or that you need to save more and expect your emotions to comply. The emotions are following their own ancient logic, a logic that made perfect sense for survival in small tribal groups, but creates bizarre distortions in a modern economy, where wealth is stored in databases and transferred through invisible networks. Your work, if you want to see your finances clearly, is not just intellectual; it is emotional and somatic. It involves understanding where your particular distortions come from and slowly teaching your nervous system that the old patterns no longer apply. Topic: the lottery curse. Paradox. If someone handed you $10 million tomorrow, would it change your life for the better? The obvious answer seems to be yes. Of course it would, but the data tells a different story, a disturbing one that reveals something fundamental about the relationship between external circumstances and internal psychology. Researchers who have followed lottery winners over time have found rates of bankruptcy, depression, and even suicide that far exceed the general population. People who received what should have been the ultimate financial blessing often describe it as a curse that destroyed their relationships, their sense of purpose, and their connection to the life they knew. Before winning, this seems impossible at first. How can more money make someone worse off? But when you understand wealth psychology, it makes perfect sense. The money arrived, but the person receiving it had not developed the internal architecture to hold it. They had not built the identity, the habits, the belief systems, or the social structures that would allow them to integrate sudden wealth into their lives. And so the wealth became a destabilizing force rather than a blessing, one that amplified whatever problems already existed beneath the surface. There is a saying that money does not change people. It reveals them, and this is precisely what happens with sudden windfalls. The person who had unexamined issues with trust finds themselves surrounded by people who might be using them. The person who defined themselves by their work loses their reason to get up in the morning. The person who had barely managed their drinking now has unlimited resources to fuel their addiction. The money did not create these problems. It simply removed the constraints that had been keeping them manageable. This is why the research on wealth and happiness shows a much more complicated picture than most people expect. Yes, money reduces misery up to a point. Not having enough to cover your basic needs creates genuine suffering, and eliminating that suffering matters. But beyond a certain threshold, more money does not reliably produce more happiness. In fact, it often produces new problems, new anxieties, new complications that the person was not prepared to handle. The lottery curse. Paradox teaches us that wealth is not really about the money at all. It is about what the money requires of you. The capacities you must develop to hold it, the identity you must build to use it wisely, the relationships you must cultivate to remain connected to your humanity when you have more than you need. If you try to skip these developmental requirements, if you try to have the external wealth without the internal development, you will likely find yourself worse off than before. Not because money is bad, but because money without wisdom is like a powerful tool in untrained hands, capable of causing tremendous damage to yourself and everyone around you. Topic: the invisibility of true wealth. The truly wealthy rarely look wealthy, and this is one of the most important and least understood principles in money psychology. We are surrounded by images of wealth that are actually images of spending people in expensive clothes, driving expensive cars, living in expensive homes. But spending is not wealth. Spending is the opposite of wealth. It is the conversion of wealth into visible consumption. And the more you see someone spending, the less wealth they likely have behind the facade. This creates a peculiar blindness in how most people think about financial success. They model their aspirations on what they can observe, but what they observe is almost always misleading. The person in the luxury car might be drowning in debt, while their neighbor in the modest sedan might have investments worth millions. The person in the designer clothes might be living paycheck to paycheck, while the plainly dressed person beside them might be financially independent. There is simply no way to tell by looking. Because true wealth is invisible. It exists in accounts and assets and options and freedoms that never show up in the visual field. This invisibility is not accidental for many wealthy people. It is strategic. They have discovered that visible consumption brings problems attention from people who want something, resentment from people who have less pressure to maintain appearances that require ongoing expenditure, and so they learn to live below their means, to drive unremarkable cars, to wear unremarkable clothes, to signal their status in subtle ways that only other wealthy people recognize, while remaining invisible to everyone else. This creates a problem for anyone trying to build wealth, because the models we absorb from culture are almost entirely wrong. We see the spending, we do not see the saving. We see the consumption, we do not see the investment. We see the lifestyle, we do not see the years of discipline that created the capital that could support the lifestyle, if the person chose to spend it, which often they do not. The person genuinely on the path to wealth is usually indistinguishable from their neighbors. They are not denying themselves pleasure. They simply derive their pleasure from different sources, from watching their net worth grow, from knowing they have options, from the security that comes from capital, rather than the fleeting status that comes from consumption. They understand something that took them years to learn, that the appearance of wealth is not only different from actual wealth, it is often opposed to it, because every dollar spent on appearing wealthy is a dollar not invested in becoming wealthy. And over time, this difference compounds into an enormous gap between those who optimize for how things look and those who optimize for how things are. Topic: Loss aversion. Asymmetry. Your brain experiences a $100 loss and a $100 gain as completely different events, even though the amounts are identical. The loss feels worse, much worse than the gain feels good. Researchers have measured this asymmetry carefully and found that losses typically hurt about 2.5 times more than equivalent gains. Please, this is not a small effect. It is a massive distortion in how we process financial reality, one that shapes nearly every money decision we make in ways we rarely recognize. Losing $50 creates the same emotional magnitude as gaining $125, which means that a fair bet, one with equal chances of winning or losing the same amount, will always feel like a bad deal to your brain, even when the math says it is neutral. This loss aversion evolved for good reasons in ancestral environments. Losing resources could mean death, while gaining the same resources provided a smaller marginal benefit. If you already had enough to survive, it made sense for the brain to weight losses more heavily, to make organisms more careful about risking what they had. But in modern financial contexts, this ancient wiring creates serious problems. It makes people sell winning investments too early, locking in gains before they have fully developed, because the fear of losing those gains becomes overwhelming. It makes people hold losing investments too long, refusing to sell at a loss, even when the rational move would be to cut their losses and redeploy the capital elsewhere. It creates a strange paralysis where people cannot bring themselves to take actions that might involve loss, even when the expected value clearly favors action. The most successful investors learn to recognize this bias and compensate for it. They know that their instincts will scream at them to avoid losses at nearly any cost, and so they build systems and rules that override those instincts. They force themselves to sell losers and hold winners. They take calculated risks that feel uncomfortable because they understand that comfort and optimal financial outcomes are often opposed. They develop the capacity to feel the loss, aversion to acknowledge its pull, and then to act differently. Anyway, this is not about suppressing emotions or becoming some kind of financial robot. It is about developing awareness of the bias and creating space between the feeling and the response. The feeling will always be there, your brain will always weight losses more heavily. That is simply how the hardware works, but between that feeling and your action, there is a gap. And in that gap lies your freedom to choose based on what you actually want, rather than what your ancient survival instincts demand. Topic: present bias and hyperbolic discounting. If someone offered you $100 today or $110 in a week, which would you choose? Most people take the money now. Even though waiting would produce a 10% return in just 7 days, which is an extraordinary rate by any reasonable measure. But if someone offered you $100 in 1 year or $110 in 1 year and 1 week, almost everyone is willing to wait the extra week. The math is identical in both cases. Waiting 7 days produces a 10% gain, but our psychology treats these situations completely differently. When the reward is immediate, we become impatient. When it is distant, we become rational. This phenomenon is called hyperbolic discounting, and it explains an enormous amount about why people struggle to build wealth. The future feels abstract and unreal, while the present feels vivid and urgent. $1 today carries emotional weight that $1 next year simply cannot match. Even if you intellectually understand that the future dollar invested wisely might become many dollars, your emotional system does not fully believe in that future. It is optimizing for now, because now is the only thing that feels real. This is why saving is so difficult. Not because people do not understand compound interest, but because the sacrifice happens in the immediate present, while the benefits exist in a future that seems almost theoretical. The new purchase delivers dopamine right now. The retirement account delivers nothing. You can feel just numbers on a screen that promise future consumption you cannot quite imagine. And so the present wins over and over again, creating patterns of spending that make perfect emotional sense in the moment, but lead to devastating outcomes. Over decades, the people who successfully build wealth have found ways to make the future more real and present to themselves. They visualize their future selves as actual people who will suffer or thrive based on choices made today. They create systems that automate saving so the money moves before they have a chance to spend it. They surround themselves with others who value long-term thinking, which makes that orientation feel normal rather than like a sacrifice. They understand that they are fighting against deep evolutionary programming, and so they do not rely on willpower alone. They build structures that do the work their willpower cannot do consistently. Topic: the Diderot Effect. The philosopher Denis Diderot lived much of his life in poverty until one day he received a generous gift, a beautiful scarlet robe far finer than anything else he owned. He was delighted at first, but then something strange began to happen as he looked around his study. The robe made everything else look shabby by comparison. His old chair seemed unworthy of someone who wore such a fine garment. His desk was clearly inadequate. His rug was an embarrassment. And so Diderot began upgrading, replacing one item after another each new purchase, demanding further purchases to maintain some kind of coherence, until he found himself in debt, having spent far more than the robe was worth trying to match everything to its level. This pattern now bears his name, the Diderot Effect. And once you see it, you will recognize it everywhere. In modern consumer life, you buy a new car, and suddenly your garage seems too cluttered to house it. You renovate your kitchen, and now the living room looks dated. You get a promotion, and your entire wardrobe needs upgrading. Each purchase creates a kind of gravitational field, pulling other purchases toward it, demanding a coherent whole that can never quite be achieved. Because there is always something that does not match, something that reveals itself as inadequate. Once you have raised the standard somewhere else, the marketing industry understands this effect intimately, which is why they do not just sell you products. They sell you entry points into entire ecosystems of consumption. The phone requires the case, the charger, the apps, the accessories, the upgrade plan, the new phone next year. Each product is a doorway into a hallway, lined with more doorways, and the only way to stop moving through them is to recognize the pattern and consciously opt out, which is much harder than it sounds, because the desire for coherence is not shallow or stupid. It reflects something real about how we relate to our possessions and environments. We want things to fit together to make sense as a whole, and marketers exploit this desire by ensuring that nothing ever quite fits, that there is always a gap between what you have and what would make it complete. The wealthy understand that this game is unwinnable, not because they have transcended desire, but because they have recognized the trap. They might own beautiful things, but they have developed the capacity to let those things sit alongside less beautiful things, without feeling the compulsive need to upgrade everything. They have made peace with inconsistency, which is the only way to escape the ratchet of perpetual consumption that the Diderot Effect creates. Topic: Hedonic Adaptation. Imagine something wonderful happens to you. A dream comes true. An achievement unlocks, a windfall arrives. How long would that happiness last? Most people dramatically overestimate the duration of their future emotional states. They think the new house will make them happy for years, the promotion will produce lasting satisfaction, the purchase will continue delivering pleasure long after the novelty fades. But the research shows something very different. We adapt, and we adapt quickly. The psychological term is hedonic adaptation, and it describes our remarkable ability to return to a baseline level of happiness regardless of what happens to us, good or bad. This adaptation is powerful enough that lottery winners are typically no happier than control groups within just a few months of their windfall, and people who suffer serious accidents often return close to their baseline happiness within a year or two. What seem like life-changing events turn out to have surprisingly temporary effects on subjective well-being for wealth psychology. This has profound implications. It means that pursuing money in order to feel happy is largely a trap. You will get the money, you will feel happy briefly, and then you will adapt. You will need more money to produce the same feeling, creating a treadmill where you run faster and faster without ever getting anywhere new. There is always another level, another target, another threshold that seems like it will finally be enough. And it never is, because enough is not a number. It is a relationship between your expectations and your circumstances, and your expectations rise to meet your circumstances automatically, without any effort on your part. This is not to say that money cannot improve your life. It clearly can, especially if you are starting from genuine scarcity. Having enough to cover your needs reduces stress, creates options, and removes the cognitive burden of constant financial worry. But beyond that threshold, the relationship between money and happiness becomes increasingly unreliable. You have to get more strategic about how you deploy resources if you want them to actually produce well-being. And that strategy often involves directing money toward experiences, rather than possessions, toward time, rather than things, toward other people, rather than yourself. The research suggests these forms of spending are more resistant to adaptation, that a meaningful trip will produce longer-lasting satisfaction than an equivalent expensive object, because experiences become part of your identity and memory in ways that possessions do not. They compound over time through reminiscence and storytelling, rather than depreciating through familiarity, and where the sophisticated wealth psychologist understands that the point is not to earn as much as possible, but to convert whatever you earn into actual quality of life, which requires understanding how adaptation works and designing your spending to work with it rather than against it. Topic: Scarcity Brain. When you do not have enough, something changes in how you think. Not just what you think about, but the actual mechanics of cognition, the structure of attention, the capacity for planning. Researchers have documented this effect carefully in populations experiencing various forms of scarcity. And what they found was striking. Scarcity captures the mind. It forces a kind of tunnel vision where the thing you lack becomes the dominant focus, crowding out everything else. If you are hungry, you cannot stop thinking about food. If you are lonely, you cannot stop scanning for social connection. If you are poor, you cannot stop worrying about money. This capture might seem adaptive, and in some ways it is focusing on urgent problems, helps you solve them. But the costs are severe, because while scarcity is capturing your attention, it is also depleting your cognitive resources. Studies show that poverty is equivalent to losing 13 IQ points. Not because poor people are less intelligent, but because the constant mental load of managing scarcity leaves fewer resources for everything else. Decisions become worse, not because of who you are, but because of what your circumstances require of you. This has enormous implications for understanding why poverty is so hard to escape. It is not simply that poor people have less money. It is that having less money makes it harder to make the kinds of decisions that would lead to having more money. The cognitive tax of scarcity works against you at every turn, tempting you toward short-term choices that provide immediate relief at the cost of long-term outcomes. When your mental bandwidth is exhausted by managing, today you have little left to invest in planning for tomorrow. And the tragedy is that from the outside, this looks like poor decision-making, like personal failure when it is actually a predictable consequence of an environment that no amount of willpower can fully overcome. The path out of scarcity often requires somehow creating enough slack, enough margin, that the scarcity mindset begins to release its grip. This might mean radical simplification of financial life, reducing the number of decisions that need to be made. It might mean building even a small buffer, a few $100s that can absorb minor emergencies, without triggering the full scarcity response. It might mean finding ways to automate good decisions so they happen without requiring the cognitive resources. You do not have to spare. The goal is to escape the gravitational pull of scarcity brain, enough to start thinking clearly about the future. And once you can do that, once you have even a little margin to work with, the compounding begins working in your favor instead of against you. Topic: the paradox of choice. More options should make us better off. The logic seems unassailable. If you can choose from 3 investment funds, you might find one that suits you. If you can choose from 30, you will surely find one that suits you better. But the research reveals something counterintuitive. More choice often makes us worse off, not better. It increases anxiety, creates regret, and can paralyze us into making no choice at all. This is the paradox of choice, and it operates powerfully in financial contexts, where the number of options has exploded far beyond what any individual can meaningfully evaluate. Consider retirement investing, where workers are often presented with dozens of fund options, each with its own risk profile, fee structure, and historical performance. The rational person would carefully analyze each option and select the optimal portfolio. But rational analysis has limits, and those limits are reached quickly when faced with overwhelming complexity. What actually happens is that people either choose randomly, choose whatever seems familiar, or choose not to choose at all, accepting default options or simply not. Participating the paralysis created by too many choices might be the most costly outcome, because the person who cannot decide often ends up doing nothing, and doing nothing in financial contexts has enormous long-term consequences. The simplification that wealth builders learn is not a sign of unsophistication. It is a recognition that human cognition has limits, and that a simpler approach you actually execute will outperform a complex approach that overwhelms you into inaction. This is why many successful investors deliberately constrain their options. They choose a small number of investments they understand and ignore. Everything else, they create rules that eliminate whole categories of decisions. They accept that they might miss some opportunities in exchange for the consistency that comes from a manageable cognitive load. They have learned that the goal is not to optimize each individual choice, but to create a system they can actually follow over decades. And simple systems are easier to follow. They reduce the friction that causes people to give up. They make good behavior automatic rather than effortful. And over time, the person with the simple system will almost certainly outperform the person with the complex one. Not because simple is smarter, but because simple is sustainable. Topic: sunk cost psychology. You have already invested so much, it would be wasteful to stop. Now, this thought has destroyed more wealth than almost any other financial error. The sunk cost fallacy describes our tendency to continue investing in something because of what we have already put in, rather than based on what we can expect to get out. And it operates almost universally across domains. We stay in bad relationships because of the years we have already invested. We continue losing investments because selling would mean admitting the loss. We persist with failing business ventures because of all the money already spent. The logic feels compelling in the moment. Those resources were real. They cost you something. It seems wrong to just abandon them, but this logic is exactly backwards. The resources you have already spent are gone. They cannot be recovered, regardless of what you do next. The only relevant question is whether continuing to invest will produce returns that justify the additional investment, not whether you will feel bad about what you already lost. This is remarkably hard to internalize, because our accounting systems, both psychological and practical, often obscure it. We see the total investment, not the marginal one. We feel the cumulative loss, not the opportunity cost of continued investment. The research shows that even trained professionals fall victim to sunk cost reasoning in their own decisions. that knowing about the fallacy provides only partial protection against it. The most effective strategy is not to try to reason your way through each decision, but to build structures that force you to think in terms of opportunity cost. What else could this money do right now if you ask that question consistently? If you evaluate each investment as if you were deciding whether to make it fresh today, you begin to escape the grip of sunk costs. You might still feel the pull of what you have already invested, but you will be less likely to let that pull determine your actions, and in financial contexts, where the compounding effects of decisions extend over decades. This difference between good and bad decision-making accumulates into vast differences in outcomes. The person who cuts losses early and redeploys capital where it can grow will build wealth that the person anchored to past decisions will never achieve. Topic: Mental accounting illusions. Money is fungible. A dollar is a dollar, regardless of where it came from or what you intend to use it for. But your brain does not treat money this way at all. Instead, it creates separate mental accounts, each with their own rules and emotional valences. Money in the vacation fund feels different from money in the emergency fund, feels different from money in the checking account, even though they are all just money. This mental accounting creates systematic irrationalities that cost you wealth in ways you probably do not notice. Consider how differently most people treat a tax refund compared to regular income. The refund is often seen as found money, a windfall to be spent on something fun, while regular income goes to bills and necessities. But the tax refund is not found money. It is your money that you overpaid to the government throughout the year. It is identical in every meaningful way to regular income, except for the psychological frame around it. And that frame makes it far more likely to be spent frivolously. Or consider the person who keeps money in a savings account, earning 2% interest while carrying credit card debt at 20% interest from a pure math perspective. They are losing 18% annually on every dollar in savings. They should drain the savings to pay the debt immediately. But the mental accounts rebel. The savings account feels like security, like progress, like a cushion against uncertainty. Moving that money to pay debt would feel like going backwards, even though it would put them substantially ahead financially. The mental accounting illusion is not something you can simply decide to overcome. It runs deeper than conscious reasoning, but you can learn to notice it operating. You can catch yourself treating dollars differently, based on arbitrary categories, and ask whether that treatment actually serves your goals. Sometimes different mental accounts can help with budgeting and self-control, but often it creates expensive mistakes. The sophisticated wealth psychologist learns to see through the illusion, to recognize that a dollar saved and a dollar earned, and a dollar found and a dollar given are all the same. Dollar deserving the same careful consideration about how to deploy it most effectively. Topic: The Disposition Effect. Investors consistently make a particular error so reliably that it has its own name. The Disposition Effect describes the tendency to sell investments that have increased in value too early, while holding investments that have declined in value too long. In other words, we take our winners off the table before they have fully run, and we keep our losers hoping they will recover. This pattern is exactly backwards from what rational investing would suggest. Winning investments are often winning for reasons that will continue. They have momentum, positive underlying trends, and demonstrated strength. Holding them longer captures more of their upside. Losing investments are often losing for reasons that will continue cutting them quickly. Limits the damage and frees capital to invest elsewhere, but our psychology pulls us in the opposite direction, and the mechanism is fascinating. It relates to how we experience gains and losses relative to our reference points when an investment is upselling. It locks in a gain and produces the pleasure of realized profit when an investment is down, selling it. Forces us to realize a loss and experience the pain of admitting we were wrong. So we sell the winners to feel good and hold the losers to avoid feeling bad. And the market steadily transfers wealth from us to those who have learned to do the opposite. The professional traders and investors who consistently outperform have often simply learned to reverse this tendency. They let their winners run and cut their losers quickly. And they have usually had to train themselves to do this against their natural inclinations. They use stop losses and position limits and rules that force them to sell when the market tells them they are wrong. They have learned to feel comfortable with a high percentage of losing trades because their winners more than compensate. and they understand that the goal is not to be right most of the time, but to make money over time, which are very different things. Your natural disposition will cost you dearly in markets if you do not actively work against it. The pain of loss, the pleasure of gain. These are powerful forces that will drive your behavior unless you build systems to override them, and building those systems might be the single most profitable skill you ever develop. Topic: Anchoring in arbitrary coherence. The first number you hear changes everything that comes after, even when that number has no logical relevance to the decision at hand. This is anchoring, one of the most robust findings in judgment and decision-making research, and it operates with remarkable power in financial contexts. Imagine you see a house listed at $800,000, you negotiate hard and get it for $700,000. You feel like you got a bargain, but what if the house was only worth $500,000? The anchor of $800,000 shaped your entire perception, making $700,000 feel reasonable when it was actually a terrible price. Anchors work because our minds need starting points for estimation, and we are not good at adjusting away from those starting points sufficiently. Once an anchor is set, it distorts all subsequent judgment in its direction. The research shows that even random numbers affect estimates, that even clearly irrelevant information can anchor our thinking, that even experts fall victim to anchoring in their domains of expertise. What makes this particularly dangerous for wealth psychology is something researchers call arbitrary coherence. Once an anchor is set, our subsequent choices become coherent with that anchor. Even though the anchor itself was arbitrary, you pay a certain price for something, and now that price becomes reasonable. Now similar items at similar prices seem appropriately valued, and the entire structure of your financial decisions begins to organize around anchors that may have been set by accident, by marketing, by whatever number happened to reach you first. The defense against anchoring is not easy because the bias operates below conscious awareness. You cannot simply decide to ignore anchors, but you can become more deliberate about which anchors you allow to influence you. You can seek out multiple reference points instead of accepting the first one. You can learn the actual value of things through research, rather than relying on listed prices. You can notice when you are comparing something to an anchor and ask whether that anchor is actually relevant to what you are trying to decide. And perhaps most importantly, you can be the one setting anchors in negotiations and transactions. Because if anchors are going to shape outcomes, and they always do, it is better to be the one choosing where to drop them. Topic: Herd behavior and social proof. When you do not know what to do, you look to others. This is not a weakness, it is a deeply sensible heuristic that has served humans well for hundreds of thousands of years. Other people have information that you lack, and following their behavior allows you to benefit from that information without having to acquire it yourself. If everyone is running in one direction, there is probably a predator, there is probably danger. The one who stops to independently verify while everyone else flees is the one who gets eaten. But in financial markets, this sensible heuristic becomes a trap, because the behavior you observe in others is often itself based on observing others, creating feedback loops that can carry prices far from any rational foundation. The dot-com bubble, the housing bubble, the cryptocurrency mania of various cycles all share this dynamic. People bought, not because they had independently assessed value, but because they saw others buying and assumed those others must know something they did not. The buying drove prices up, which attracted more attention, which drew in more buyers, which drove prices higher still, until the entire structure collapsed because it was built on nothing but the circular logic of social proof. The most successful investors have learned to use social proof as a contrarian indicator, not as a guide. When everyone is enthusiastic about something, it is probably too late to profit from buying it. When everyone is terrified of something, it might be exactly the time to consider it. They have trained themselves to notice when they are following the herd, and to pause and question whether independent analysis would lead them in the same direction. This is not easy because going against the crowd creates psychological discomfort. We are tribal creatures, and tribal creatures survive by staying with the group. The person who separates from the herd is vulnerable, exposed, alone, and that ancient fear can make it feel genuinely dangerous to take investment positions that others would question. even though the actual danger in modern financial contexts is usually in following the crowd, not leaving it. The wealthy often become wealthy precisely because they can tolerate this discomfort. They can sit with positions that everyone around them thinks are wrong. They can wait for their analysis to play out while others mock or criticize. They have developed the psychological capacity to be alone in their convictions, which turns out to be one of the most profitable capacities you can develop. Topic: Overconfidence and the illusion of skill. Almost everyone believes they are an above-average driver, which is statistically impossible but psychologically revealing. We systematically overestimate our abilities, our knowledge, our capacity to predict and control outcomes. This overconfidence is nearly universal, but its effects in financial contexts are particularly destructive because markets are extraordinarily efficient at separating overconfident people from their money. The research on investor performance shows a consistent pattern. Those who trade more frequently based on their confident predictions of what will happen next tend to underperform those who trade less frequently, the churning of portfolios. The constant buying and selling based on conviction that one knows which way things will move tends to generate fees and taxes and mistakes that eat into returns, while the patient investor who acknowledges uncertainty and simply holds diversified assets often comes out ahead. This is humbling because it suggests that much of what feels like skill in investing is actually luck, that the confident stories we tell about why we bought and sold and what we knew are largely retrospective fabrications that our brains construct to make random outcomes feel meaningful and controlled. The professional investors who do consistently outperform, and they are rare, have usually developed an unusual relationship with uncertainty. They have learned to hold their views loosely, to update constantly as new information arrives, to think in probabilities rather than certainties. They often have explicit processes for seeking out evidence that might prove them wrong, because they know their brains will naturally filter for evidence that confirms what they already believe they have traded. The comfort of confidence for the effectiveness of calibrated uncertainty. And that trade is enormously difficult for most people to make, because confidence feels good and uncertainty feels bad, and we are motivated to feel good, not to be accurate. This is why markets continue to attract overconfident participants who are sure they can beat the averages, even though the averages consistently beat them. They are not stupid, they are human. They are running the same psychological software that worked well in ancestral environments, where confidence actually improved outcomes, and that software misfires in modern financial markets, where humility turns out to be the more profitable posture. Topic: The availability heuristic. Your brain estimates the probability of events based on how easily examples come to mind, and this shortcut creates systematic errors in financial judgment, because what comes to mind easily is not what happens most frequently. It is what is most vivid, most recent, most emotionally charged. The plane crash makes the news, the millions of safe flights do not. And so flying feels dangerous, even though the statistics show it is remarkably safe. Similarly, in financial contexts, the spectacular gains and losses receive attention, while the slow, steady compounding that actually builds wealth remains invisible. You hear about the person who made a fortune on a single investment. You do not hear about the thousands who tried the same thing and lost. You hear about market crashes in vivid, terrifying detail. You do not hear about the boring years of gradual appreciation that constitute most of market history. This asymmetry and availability distorts decision-making in predictable ways. It makes people overweight dramatic risks and underweight mundane ones. It makes recent events feel more significant than they probably are because they are fresh in memory. It makes whatever the media is currently focused on feel more important than the trends that receive no coverage at all. The person who makes decisions based on what comes easily to mind will systematically misread reality and make choices that do not serve their actual interests. The correction requires deliberate effort to seek out base rates, the actual frequencies of events, rather than relying on mental availability. It requires asking not what examples come to mind, but what the data shows. It requires developing a healthy skepticism toward vivid anecdotes and dramatic stories, because the very features that make them memorable are the features that make them unrepresentative. The boring statistical truth is usually closer to reality than the compelling narrative, and learning to prefer boring truth over compelling narrative is one of the most important cognitive skills a wealth builder can develop. It does not come naturally. We are wired for stories, not statistics, but it can be trained, and the training pays dividends across every financial decision you make. Topic: Status quo bias. Change requires energy, and your brain is an energy conservation machine. So when given the choice between doing something and doing nothing, you are biased toward nothing even when doing something would clearly be better. This status quo bias shows up throughout financial life in the accounts you leave at institutions that no longer serve you in the investments you hold, simply because you already hold them in the insurance policies and subscriptions and services you continue paying for. Because canceling requires effort. The research on default options reveals just how powerful this bias is when retirement plans automatically enroll employees. Participation rates soar compared to plans where employees must opt in. The only difference is which choice requires action, and that small difference produces dramatically different outcomes across millions of people. Each individual could change their status, but most will not, because the status quo exerts a kind of gravitational pull that takes active effort to escape. This bias is not entirely irrational. There are good reasons to be cautious about change. Change has costs, both obvious and hidden, and the status quo at least has the virtue of being known. But in many financial contexts, the status quo is actively harmful. It is the high-fee fund. You never switched out of the savings account, earning nothing, the debt you keep meaning to consolidate, and never do the subscription. You keep paying for services you no longer use. Each of these drains wealth slowly and visibly without the dramatic trigger that would prompt action, and so they continue, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, quietly transferring money from you to someone else. The wealthy have often learned to conduct periodic audits of their financial status quo, to look with fresh eyes at arrangements that have been in place so long. They have become invisible. They ask of each account, each investment, each recurring expense, whether they would choose it today if they were starting fresh, and when the answer is no, they make the change. Even though making the change requires effort, they have learned that the effort of changing is almost always less than the cost of not changing, and that the status quo bias is a tax on inertia that compounds over time into substantial wealth destruction. Topic: The Endowment Effect. The coffee mug experiments have become famous in behavioral economics. Give someone a mug and ask how much they would sell it for. Then ask someone else how much they would pay to buy the same mug. The sellers consistently demand more than the buyers will pay, typically about twice as much, even though both are looking at the same object. This is the endowment effect, our tendency to value things more highly, simply because we own them, and it creates persistent distortions in financial decision-making. The stock you own feels more valuable than the same stock you do not own. The house you live in seems worth more than comparable houses on the market. Your business, your investments, your possessions all carry a premium in your mind that exists nowhere else. And this premium prevents you from making trades that would benefit you. It keeps you holding assets you would never buy at current prices. It makes you demand more to sell than the market will pay. It creates a kind of financial stickiness, where your portfolio becomes locked into whatever you happen to already own. Regardless of whether those holdings still make sense, the mechanism seems to be related to loss. Aversion, selling something you own, feels like a loss, even if you receive money in return, and so you require extra compensation to offset the pain of that perceived loss. The buyer experiences no such pain. They are simply acquiring something new with no loss involved, and so they do not share your inflated sense of what the thing is worth. This asymmetry means that transactions that should happen do not, that mutually beneficial trades fail to occur, because sellers want more than buyers will give. And the endowment effect sits in the gap. The sophisticated investor learns to notice when they are valuing something more highly, simply because they own it. They learn to ask what they would pay to acquire the asset today, and to compare that number to what they would demand to sell it when there is a large gap. And there usually is. They know the endowment effect is operating, and they can at least consider whether the rational move might be to sell something they have been holding for reasons that dissolve under examination. Topic: Fear and greed. Oscillation. Markets are driven by two emotions, and only two Warren Buffett famously observed, and the oscillation between them creates both the danger and the opportunity in financial life, fear and greed. Take turns dominating investor psychology cycling in patterns that are somewhat predictable in their existence. If not in their precise timing, greed dominates when prices have been rising for a while. When everyone seems to be making money, when the stories of easy wealth become common enough that even skeptics begin to wonder if they are missing out. This is when people take on too much risk, when they abandon diversification to concentrate in whatever is working, when they borrow to invest and assume the good times will continue indefinitely. Greed tells a seductive story that the normal rules have been suspended, that this time really is different, that the gains will keep coming forever. And some people believe that story, right until the moment it reverses. Then fear takes over. Fear dominates after prices have fallen, after losses have accumulated, after the stories shift from easy riches to devastating ruin. This is when people abandon risk entirely, when they sell at the bottom and move to cash, when they conclude that markets are too dangerous and vow never to return. Fear tells its own seductive story that the losses will continue forever, that there is no bottom, that safety requires complete withdrawal from risk. And some people believe that story right at the moment when the best opportunities are appearing. The wealthy have learned to recognize these emotional states, both in themselves and in the market as a whole. They have developed the capacity to feel fear without being controlled by it, to notice greed without being captured by it. They use these emotions as information rather than as commands. When they feel greedy, they become more cautious. When they feel afraid, they look for opportunities. When everyone around them is experiencing the same emotion, they take that unanimity as a warning sign, because extreme consensus in emotional states tends to mark turning points. The skill is not emotional suppression, it is emotional awareness, plus the capacity to act independently of what you feel. And this skill takes years to develop, requires many cycles of experience, and is still imperfect even in the most seasoned practitioners, because fear and greed are powerful ancient forces that never fully submit to rational control. Topic: regret aversion. The pain of regret is so intense that people will make objectively worse decisions simply to avoid the possibility of experiencing it. Consider the choice between a sure thing and a gamble with higher expected value. Many people choose the sure thing, not because they have calculated the odds, but because they cannot bear the thought of having gambled and lost the regret of an active choice. That turned out badly feels worse than the regret of a passive choice, even when the passive choice produces worse outcomes. On average, this is regret aversion, and it shapes financial behavior in ways that consistently destroy wealth. People hold losing investments rather than sell them because selling and then watching the investment recover would create unbearable regret. They stick with familiar investments rather than diversify, because buying something new that then performs poorly would feel worse than staying with something old that performs poorly. They avoid action altogether because any action could turn out to be wrong, and the anticipated regret of being wrong paralyzes them into inaction. The strange thing about regret aversion is that it does not actually minimize regret. It just shifts when and how regret occurs. The person who never invests to avoid the regret of investment losses will eventually regret not investing. But that regret comes later, diffused over time, rather than concentrated in a single painful moment of having chosen wrong. And our psychology treats these differently, even though the outcome may be worse. The regret that builds slowly feels more bearable than the regret that arrives suddenly, which is why regret aversion creates a bias toward inaction and toward choices that feel safe, even when they are not the investor who has learned to work with regret. Aversion does not try to eliminate the emotion but accepts it as a cost of taking action. They know that any choice they make might turn out to be wrong, that they will sometimes experience regret, and they have decided that experiencing occasional regret is an acceptable price for making decisions that serve their long-term interests. They have shifted their focus from avoiding regret to making good decisions, and they accept whatever emotional consequences follow from those decisions. This shift is subtle but transformative because it frees you to act even when action carries the risk of feeling bad later. Topic: Narrative fallacy in markets. Human beings are storytelling animals. We cannot help but construct narratives to explain the events we observe. And these narratives feel true, even when they are fabrications, when the market goes up. We tell stories about why it went up, about economic conditions and investor sentiment and policy decisions. And these stories make sense. They feel explanatory. They give us the satisfying sense that we understand what happened. But the research suggests that much market movement is essentially random, that the stories we tell are retrofitted explanations imposed on noise, that we are finding patterns where patterns do not exist. This is the narrative fallacy, and it is particularly dangerous in financial contexts because the stories we tell about the past shape our expectations about the future. If we believe we understand why the market rose, we believe we can predict when it will rise again if we think we know what caused a crash. We think we can anticipate the next one. But if the stories are wrong, if they are just pleasing fictions draped over randomness, then our predictions based on those stories will fail, and we will be surprised again and again by events. Our narratives did not anticipate. The financial media is essentially in the business of producing narratives every day. They must explain market movements, even when those movements have no real explanation. They interview experts who offer confident stories about what happened and why. And these stories are entertaining. They feel informative. They satisfy our craving for understanding. But they are largely noise dressed up as signal. The person who takes these stories seriously, who believes the narratives and trades on them, is usually worse off than the person who ignores them entirely and simply follows a boring mechanical strategy that does not pretend to understand why markets move the way they do. This is counterintuitive because understanding feels valuable and narrative feels like understanding. But in domains where randomness dominates, the attempt to understand through narrative often makes things worse. It creates false confidence. It encourages trading based on stories, and the stories are usually wrong. The wealthy investor has often made peace with not understanding, with accepting that markets will move in ways that surprise them, and building strategies that are robust to that surprise, rather than strategies that depend on correctly predicting what will happen next. Topic: Hindsight bias. After something happens, it seems obvious that it was going to happen. The signs were there, the warnings were clear. Anyone paying attention should have seen it coming. This is hindsight bias, and it systematically distorts how we learn from experience, because we cannot accurately remember what we believed before. We knew the outcome. The information environment before the event included enormous uncertainty, many possible outcomes, countless paths the future might take. But once one of those paths became actual, our memory rewrites itself to make that path seem inevitable, and all the genuine uncertainty we felt at the time disappears, replaced by a false sense that we knew or should have known what was going to happen. This bias makes it very difficult to learn the right lessons from financial history, because we keep concluding that events were predictable when they were not. We look at crashes and bubbles and turning points, and we see the warning signs with crystalline clarity from our position in the future, and we think, next time I will see those signs in advance. Next time I will get out before the crash. Next time I will buy at the bottom. But we will not, because the clarity we experience now is an illusion created by knowing how things turned out. When the next crisis approaches, it will not feel like the last one. It will have different features, different circumstances, different stories, and the warning signs will be visible only in retrospect. Once we know where to look, the defense against hindsight bias requires humility about our predictive abilities. It requires keeping records of what we actually believed and predicted before outcomes were known, so we can compare our predictions to reality rather than to our reconstructed memories. It requires accepting that uncertainty is genuine, that the future is not knowable in advance, and that anyone who claims they saw it coming is probably either lying or deceived by their own hindsight bias, including ourselves. Especially ourselves, because our brains are designed to create the illusion that we understand more than we do, and this illusion feels completely convincing from the inside. Topic: Recency bias. What happened recently feels more important and more likely to continue than what happened long ago. This is recency bias, and it creates a kind of financial whiplash, where investors are constantly overreacting to the recent past, as if it were a reliable guide to the future after a few good years in the stock market. Recency bias makes continued gains feel probable, makes risk feel low, makes it seem safe to increase exposure, right when risk is often highest after a few bad years. Recency bias makes continued losses feel likely, makes all investment feel dangerous, makes it seem prudent to reduce exposure, right when opportunity is often greatest. The actual historical record shows that markets move in cycles, that good periods and bad periods alternate in patterns that are somewhat predictable in their existence, if not in their timing. But recency bias obscures this pattern. It makes whatever is happening now feel like the permanent state of affairs, and leads to decisions that would only make sense if the current trend continued forever, which it never does. The professional investor learns to adjust for recency bias by deliberately considering longer time horizons. They force themselves to look at 10-year returns, not 10-month returns, to consider multiple market cycles, not just the current one, to remember that today's environment will eventually change, even if they cannot predict exactly when or how. This requires active effort. Because recency is sticky, it takes mental energy to hold long historical perspectives in mind, while the recent past is vivid and immediate and automatically salient. The discipline of long-term thinking is exactly that. A discipline, something that must be practiced and maintained against the natural tendency of the mind to overweight. What just happened? The person who can consistently think in decades rather than months has an enormous advantage over the person who cannot, because markets reward patience and punish reactivity, and recency bias is one of the main drivers of reactive decisions that destroy wealth over time. Topic: Confirmation bias. Once you believe something, you will find evidence everywhere you look that confirms it, and evidence that contradicts it will somehow fail to register with the same force. This is confirmation bias, and it may be the most pervasive distortion in human cognition, affecting everything from political opinions to relationship judgments to financial decisions. You buy a stock, and suddenly you notice every piece of positive news about that company, while negative news seems less important, less relevant, less likely to be true. You develop a view about where markets are heading, and you consume media that supports that view, while dismissing sources that disagree as biased or uninformed. Your beliefs become self-reinforcing, not because they are correct, but because your information filtering system is biased toward confirming whatever you already think. The financial consequences of confirmation bias are severe, because markets have a way of punishing overconfidence, and confirmation bias is an overconfidence generator. It makes you more certain than you should be by systematically hiding the evidence that might create appropriate doubt. The person who believes the market will rise seeks out bullish commentary and finds it. The person who believes it will fall seeks out bearish commentary and finds it. Both become more confident in their opposing views, even though only one can be right, and possibly neither is. The defense against confirmation bias requires actively seeking out evidence against your current views, which is psychologically uncomfortable because disconfirming evidence creates cognitive dissonance. It threatens beliefs you have invested in it, suggests you might be wrong, and being wrong feels bad, so we avoid it, and in avoiding it, we become worse and worse, calibrated, more and more certain of views that may be completely mistaken. The sophisticated investor has learned to value the discomfort of disconfirmation, to seek out the smartest people who disagree with them, to steelman opposing views, rather than strawmanning them. They have learned that the pain of updating beliefs is much less than the pain of holding wrong beliefs and acting on them, and they have trained themselves to feel the pull of confirmation bias and resist it, even though resisting it never becomes easy. Topic: Home bias and familiarity. Investors consistently overweight assets from their own country, their own region, their own employer, their own industry. This home bias is well documented and persistent even among professional investors who should know better, and it reflects something deep about how we assess risk. We tend to believe that familiar things are safer than unfamiliar things. Even when the actual risk is the same, or even higher, your own company feels safer, because you work there, because you know the people, because the brand is part of your daily life, but this familiarity is actually a reason to hold less, not more of that stock, because your income is already tied to the company's success. Adding stock exposure concentrates your risk in ways that diversification is supposed to prevent. The same logic applies to country exposure. Investors around the world tend to hold disproportionate amounts of their home country's assets, even when global diversification would reduce risk and potentially improve returns. They feel safer with what they know, and this feeling of safety is misleading. The mechanism seems to be that familiarity reduces the subjective experience of uncertainty. Your home market, you can follow it in your own language, you can understand the companies and the culture, and this knowledge creates comfort. But comfort is not the same as safety, and the diversification benefits of investing globally are real. Even if they require tolerating the discomfort of holding assets you understand less well. The wealthy investor has usually learned to overcome home bias through deliberate diversification, to hold global assets, even when they feel less comfortable, to recognize that the familiar is not always safe, and the unfamiliar is not always risky. They have learned that their feelings about investments are often inversely correlated with good decision-making, that what feels safe is often dangerous, and what feels dangerous is often safe. And they have built portfolios that reflect this understanding, rather than portfolios that simply minimize discomfort. Topic: action bias. When something feels wrong, doing something feels better than doing nothing. Even when doing nothing is the better choice, this is action bias, and it affects everyone from soccer goalies who dive for penalty kicks, even though staying in the center would give them better odds, to investors who trade their portfolios in response to market volatility. Even though the trading usually makes things worse, the bias makes sense from an ancestral perspective. When our predecessors faced threats, action was usually the right response. Fight or flight served survival. Waiting to see what happened often did not, so we evolved to prefer action, to feel uncomfortable with passivity, to interpret inaction as giving up or losing control. But in financial contexts, this bias is frequently counterproductive, because markets are volatile and responding to every fluctuation means constant buying and selling, which generates costs and usually locks in bad timing. The best response to most market movements is no response at all, just continuing to hold your positions and waiting for the noise to pass. But this is psychologically excruciating when your portfolio is down and something needs to be done to fix it. Doing nothing feels like defeat, even when doing nothing is exactly the right move. The professional investors who outperform often describe the hardest part of their job as doing nothing, as sitting on their hands when every instinct tells them to act. They have learned that activity feels productive, but is often destructive. That the best trades are frequently the ones you do not make. That patience, which feels like passivity, is actually one of the most profitable skills you can develop in financial markets. This does not mean all action is wrong. Sometimes acting is correct, but the default should be inaction. The burden of proof should be on the trade, not on holding still. Because action bias is pushing you toward doing something, and that push is already too strong. Anything that makes action easier makes it too easy. Topic: framing effects. The same information presented differently produces different decisions, even when logic says it should not. A medical procedure with a 90% survival rate feels very different from one with a 10% mortality rate. An investment opportunity with potential gains feels different from one with potential avoided losses. A discount feels different from a surcharge, even when the final prices are identical. These framing effects demonstrate something profound about how we process financial information. We are not responding to objective reality, but to the presentation of that reality, and whoever controls the presentation controls our response. The financial industry has become extraordinarily sophisticated at framing products and offers and opportunities in ways that exploit these effects. They know that loss framing creates urgency, that round numbers feel more significant, that the order in which information is presented affects which information dominates, and they use this knowledge to design marketing materials and product structures that push you toward choices that serve their interests, not yours. Understanding framing effects gives you a measure of defense because you can learn to reframe information yourself. Before making decisions when presented with something framed as avoiding loss, You can translate it into gain terms and see if it still feels compelling when presented with a percentage. You can convert it to absolute numbers to check if your intuition changes when presented with monthly costs. You can calculate annual costs and notice if the number suddenly seems more significant. The goal is not to find the one true frame, because there is no such thing, but to examine multiple frames and make decisions that are robust across different presentations. If a choice looks good when framed as gain and bad when framed as loss, or vice versa, that instability is a signal that your decision is being driven by framing rather than by the underlying value, and that signal should make you pause and think more carefully before acting. Topic: the illusion of control. Roll the dice gently for low numbers, throw hard for high numbers. This is nonsense. The dice do not care how you throw them, but people behave as if they do. Choosing lottery numbers, pushing buttons at crosswalks, pressing elevator buttons repeatedly, as if their actions influence outcomes that are actually beyond their control. This illusion of control extends deeply into financial life, where we believe our research, our analysis, our timing, our decisions give us influence over outcomes that are largely determined by forces we cannot affect. The market will do what the market will do, regardless of how carefully you chose your investments. And while good decisions do improve your odds, they do not give you control over results that remain fundamentally uncertain. The illusion is seductive, because control feels safe and uncertainty feels dangerous. If we believe we can influence outcomes through skill and effort, then we are not at the mercy of random forces. Then our fate is in our hands. Then we can protect ourselves through careful action. But this belief is at least partly false. And the false part creates problems when investors believe they control outcomes. They take on too much risk. They concentrate positions. They trade too frequently. They attribute success to skill and failure to bad luck. They fail to diversify adequately because diversification implies that any single investment might fail. And if you are in control, how could it fail? The sophisticated investor holds a paradoxical relationship with control. They make the best decisions they can based on information and analysis, and then they let go of attachment to outcomes. They know that they influence but do not control results, that all the skill in the world cannot guarantee success. In any particular instance, they build portfolios that are robust to bad luck, not just optimized for expected value. They expect that some things will go wrong, and they are not surprised or demoralized when they do, because they never believed they were in complete control in the first place. This humility is not defeatism, it is realism, and it leads to better decisions than the illusion of control ever could. Topic: emotional contagion. Emotions spread between people like viruses, and financial emotions spread particularly quickly because money is inherently social. Everyone is watching what everyone else is doing, feeling what everyone else is feeling, and these shared emotional states move markets in ways that individual rational analysis never could when panic sets in. It spreads through networks of connection, through media, through conversations, through the mere awareness that others are afraid, and as it spreads, it intensifies each fearful person, adding to the fear of others, creating cascades that can carry prices far below any reasonable valuation. When euphoria takes hold, it spreads through the same channels each enthusiastic participant, amplifying the enthusiasm of others, creating bubbles that lift prices far above what fundamentals would justify. You are not immune to this contagion. No one is. The emotions of others affect you whether you want them to or not, and the financial decisions you make are shaped by the emotional environment you inhabit. The wealthy have often learned to manage their exposure to emotional contagion. They limit their consumption of financial media during volatile periods. They surround themselves with people who think long-term rather than react short-term. They create physical and psychological distance from the crowds who are buying and selling in panic or euphoria. They have learned that the crowd is usually wrong at extremes, and that protecting themselves from the crowd's emotions is essential to making decisions that serve their own interests. This does not mean isolating completely because some information is valuable, but it means filtering information through an awareness of emotional contagion. It means asking not just what is happening, but how are people feeling about what is happening, and it means being willing to feel differently from those around you, which is one of the hardest things a social animal can do. Topic: time preference. Architecture. How you relate to time determines how you relate to wealth, because wealth is fundamentally about trading present resources for future resources, and different people make these trades very differently. Some have a strong present bias. They heavily discount the future in favor of immediate consumption. They want pleasure now, and the future feels abstract and unreal. Others have a strong future orientation. They can easily sacrifice present consumption for future benefit. They find satisfaction in delayed gratification and feel genuine pleasure in watching resources grow over time. Neither orientation is inherently right or wrong, but they have dramatically different financial outcomes. The person with strong present bias will consistently convert potential wealth into immediate consumption spending. What they earn as they earn it, never allowing capital to accumulate and compound. The person with strong future orientation will consistently convert current income into future wealth, deferring consumption, building capital, watching compound growth work its magic over decades. These different orientations are not entirely fixed. They can be modified somewhat through deliberate effort and environmental design. You can strengthen your future orientation by making the future more vivid and concrete, by visualizing your future self as a real person whose welfare matters, by creating accountability structures that make present consumption more difficult and future investing more automatic. But the modification is partial at best, because time preference has deep roots in temperament and experience. You can work with your natural orientation, but you probably cannot transform it completely into something entirely different, which is why the most important financial design question might be how to build systems that produce good outcomes, given your actual time preference, rather than systems that would only work if your time preference were different. This is the architecture of wealth building, not relying on willpower to override nature, but creating structures that channel nature toward beneficial ends. Topic: Compound interest psychology. Einstein may or may not have called compound interest the eighth wonder of the world. The quote is probably apocryphal, but the sentiment is accurate. Compound interest is mathematically extraordinary, and yet psychologically invisible, which creates one of the great puzzles of personal finance. The numbers are clear. A modest sum invested early and left to compound will grow to vastly exceed larger sums. Invested later, a small percentage difference in returns will multiply over decades into enormous differences in outcomes. The math is unambiguous, but the human psychology that needs to respond to this math is not designed to grasp it. Our ancestors lived in a world without compound interest, where resources held today would still be approximately the same resources tomorrow, where the future was discounted heavily because survival was uncertain and long-term planning was often futile. We are their descendants, carrying intuitions shaped by their environment. Intuitions that systematically underestimate the power of exponential growth. This underestimation creates consistent errors in financial behavior. People start saving too late because the early years do not seem to matter much. They withdraw during downturns because they cannot viscerally feel how much those withdrawn funds would have grown. They focus on income rather than wealth, because income is linear and intuitive, while wealth growth is exponential and counterintuitive. They make decisions that would be rational in a world without compound interest, and wonder why their financial outcomes disappoint. The person who truly grasps compound interest, not just intellectually but emotionally and viscerally, behaves very differently. They feel physical discomfort at the thought of interrupting compounding. They understand in their bones that time is the most valuable financial resource and that money invested early is worth dramatically more than money invested late. They make decisions that seem strange to others because they are optimizing for a future that others cannot quite see. And the irony is that this understanding cannot really be taught through explanation. The math can be shown, but the visceral grasp comes only from experience, from watching compound growth actually happen, from seeing the numbers that once seemed abstract become concrete and meaningful, which is why the people who understand it best are usually those who started earliest and have watched the longest. Topic: The psychology of debt. Debt is not merely a financial state. It is a psychological one that reshapes how you think and feel and make decisions in ways that extend far beyond the balance sheet. The person carrying significant debt experiences the world differently from the person who is debt-free. They wake with a weight they carry through the day, a background hum of obligation that colors everything they do. This is not metaphor. The research shows measurable cognitive and emotional effects of debt, including increased stress hormones, impaired decision-making, and reduced capacity for long-term planning. The debt becomes a lens through which all financial information is filtered, and that lens distorts what you see. But the psychology of debt is more complex than simple burden, because debt also enables things that would otherwise be impossible. It allows you to buy a home before you could save for one, outright to invest in education, whose returns will take years to materialize, to start a business without waiting decades to accumulate capital. The question is not whether debt is good or bad, but how different types of debt interact with human psychology to produce different outcomes. And here, the distinctions matter enormously. Debt that builds assets that appreciate behaves very differently, psychologically, from debt that finances consumption, that depreciates the mortgage, creates equity over time. The car loan creates nothing. The student loan can increase earning power. The credit card balance typically does not. These different debts feel different, carry different meanings, create different psychological effects, even when the interest rates are similar. What makes consumer debt particularly insidious is how it interacts with hedonic adaptation. You borrow to purchase something that gives you pleasure. The pleasure fades through adaptation. But the debt remains. You are left paying for an experience that no longer exists, financing a feeling that has long since dissipated, and this creates a peculiar kind of suffering, where the burden persists after the benefit has vanished. The wealthy have usually learned to use debt strategically, if at all, to borrow only for assets that will grow, to ensure that the mathematics of leverage work in their favor, rather than against them. They understand that debt can be a tool or a trap, depending on how it is used, and they have developed the discipline to use it only when the numbers clearly justify the psychological cost of carrying obligation. Coherence topic. Identity and spending. You do not just buy things. You buy identities. Every purchase is a statement about who you are or who you want to become. The clothes you wear, the car you drive, the neighborhood you live in, the brands you choose, all of these communicate something about your place in the world. And much of what you spend money on is really an attempt to construct and maintain an identity that feels right to you. This is not shallow or superficial. It is deeply human. We are social creatures, and social creatures need to signal their position, their values, their tribal affiliations to others. Spending is one of the primary ways this signaling happens in modern economies. The problem arises when the identity you are trying to purchase is beyond your means, when you spend to appear wealthy, rather than to become wealthy, when the signaling consumes resources that should be building foundations. This is identity spending at its most destructive, and it is remarkably common because the pressure to maintain appearances is relentless, and the comparison sets we use to evaluate ourselves have expanded far beyond what our ancestors experienced. They compared themselves to a few dozen people in their immediate community. We compare ourselves to thousands or millions through media and social networks, and in that expanded comparison set, there is always someone with more, always a higher standard to aspire to, always a more impressive identity to purchase. The wealthy have often resolved this tension, not by abandoning identity entirely, but by constructing identities that do not require expensive maintenance. They derive their sense of self from things that do not cost much, from competence and relationships, and values that signal through behavior rather than consumption. They have opted out of the status competitions that require constant spending to maintain position, and in opting out, they have freed resources to actually build wealth rather than merely display it. This is not a rejection of identity, but a redefinition of it, a recognition that who you are is not determined by what you own, and that the most secure identities are those that do not depend on continued spending to sustain. Topic. Money scripts from childhood. Before you could balance a checkbook, before you understood interest rates, before you had any formal financial education, you were already learning about money. You were learning from watching how the adults around you handled it, from the emotions that surrounded financial discussions, from what was said and what was left unsaid, from the stories your family told about wealth and poverty and what kind of people had each. These early lessons became money scripts, the unconscious beliefs about money that run in the background of your mind, shaping your financial behavior in ways you rarely notice. Researchers have identified several common money scripts that cause problems. Money avoidance, where people believe money is bad or that they do not deserve it. Money worship, where people believe money will solve all problems. Money status, where self-worth becomes tied to net worth. And money vigilance, where financial anxiety dominates. Even when circumstances are secure, each script has its own characteristic patterns of behavior and its own characteristic problems. The person running a money avoidance script might sabotage their own financial success, unconsciously ensuring they never accumulate wealth. They believe they should not have the person running a money worship script might sacrifice relationships and health and meaning in endless pursuit of more. Never reaching a point of enough, the scripts run automatically below conscious awareness, producing consistent patterns that often confuse the people producing them. Why do I keep making the same financial mistakes? Why can I not seem to get ahead? Why does money create so much anxiety? Even when I have enough, these questions often have their answers in childhood, in the scripts that were written before you had any say in the matter. Changing these scripts is possible, but it requires first identifying them, bringing them from unconscious operation into conscious awareness, examining their origins, understanding why they made sense in the context where they were learned, and then deliberately choosing whether they still serve you now or whether new scripts need to be written. This is not quick work. It takes time and often benefits from professional help because the scripts are defended by the same psychological mechanisms that protect all our core beliefs. But the work is possible, and its effects can be transformative, because once you see the script, you are no longer fully controlled by it. Topic: Generational wealth patterns. Wealth tends to disappear within 3 generations. This pattern is so consistent across cultures that it has become a proverb in many languages. The first generation builds the second generation, maintains the third generation, loses what happens in that cycle. Reveals something important about the psychology of wealth accumulation and transmission. The builders typically have direct experience of scarcity. They know what it means to have nothing, and this knowledge drives their discipline and focus. They sacrifice present consumption for future security because they viscerally understand what insecurity feels like. Their children grow up with more comfort, but they still absorb some of the builder mentality through proximity. They watch their parents work, they hear the stories of struggle, they inherit some of the values that produce the wealth, even if they did not live the experiences that created those values. But the third generation is different. They grow up in abundance with no memory of scarcity, no direct connection to the struggle that built what they have. The values that produce the wealth do not transmit, because values without experience are fragile, and so the third generation often lacks the psychological equipment to maintain what they inherited, let alone grow it. This is not a moral failing, it is a predictable consequence of how psychology develops in different environments. You cannot give someone the character traits that come from overcoming adversity by shielding them from adversity. And many wealthy families discover this too late, after they have protected their children from every challenge and produced adults who cannot handle the challenges that inevitably come. The families who successfully transmit wealth across generations have usually found ways to transmit the psychology as well, not by creating artificial hardship, but by instilling values through experience, by involving children in the work of wealth building, by creating expectations and responsibilities that develop capability. They understand that the money is the easy part to transfer. It is the invisible psychological infrastructure that is hard, and without that infrastructure, the money will not last. Topic: System 1 and System 2. Your mind operates in 2 modes that feel seamlessly unified, but are actually quite different. One is fast automatic, effortless, and constantly running it. Processes information, instantly delivers intuitions and judgments, handles routine tasks without conscious attention. This is System 1. It is what allows you to drive a familiar route while thinking about something else to recognize, faces instantly to feel that something is wrong, before you can say why the other mode is slow, deliberate, effortful, and engaged only when needed. It handles complex calculations, considers multiple factors, weighs evidence and reasons carefully. This is System 2. It is what you engage when you do math in your head, or consider a difficult decision, or try to understand something new. Most financial decisions should engage System 2. They involve numbers and trade-offs and long-term consequences that require careful analysis. But System 2 is lazy. It requires energy and attention, and your brain would rather conserve both. So it hands decisions off to System 1 whenever possible. And System 1 is not equipped for financial reasoning. It runs on heuristics and intuitions that work well in many contexts but fail systematically in financial ones. This is where most financial errors come from. The fast system making decisions that the slow system never reviewed. The intuitive judgment that feels right but is actually wrong. The automatic response to financial information that would be corrected if only you stop to think carefully, but you do not stop because stopping requires effort. And effort is exactly what System 1 is designed to avoid. The sophisticated financial decision maker has learned to notice when System 1 is operating and to deliberately engage System 2. For important choices, they have learned that their first instinct about financial matters is often wrong, that the feeling of certainty is not evidence of accuracy, that the effort of careful thinking is an investment that pays returns many times over. They build in delays and reviews and second opinions, not because they distrust themselves, but because they understand how their minds work, and they design decision processes that compensate for the known weaknesses of human cognition. Topic: Cognitive load and decisions. Your capacity for good decisions is finite. It depletes through use, and when it is depleted, the quality of your decisions deteriorates. This is cognitive load, and it explains why you make worse choices when you are tired or stressed or overwhelmed. Why the decisions you make at the end of a long day differ from those you make when fresh. Why poverty, which constantly taxes cognitive resources, leads to systematically worse financial decisions. The implications for wealth building are significant because financial life presents an endless stream of decisions, each one drawing from the same limited pool of cognitive resources. The more decisions you must make, the worse each individual decision is likely to be, and the more likely you are to simply default to whatever requires the least thought, which is often not the best choice. The wealthy have often learned to reduce cognitive load through simplification and automation. They make fewer financial decisions, not more. They set up systems that handle routine matters without requiring attention. They reduce the number of accounts and investments and financial relationships they must manage. They create rules and habits that substitute for decision-making, reserving their limited cognitive resources for the choices that truly matter. This is not laziness, it is strategic conservation of a scarce resource. They understand that every unnecessary decision costs something, that complexity creates drag, that the person with the simpler financial life has more capacity available for the decisions that actually affect outcomes. This insight extends beyond finance. Any area of life that demands decisions depletes the same pool of resources, which is why successful people often simplify everything they can. Why they wear the same clothes, make the same meals, follow the same routines. They are not trying to be boring. They are trying to protect their decision-making capacity for where it counts, and for most people, few decisions count more than financial ones. Topic: Stress and financial judgment. When you are stressed, your body shifts into a mode optimized for immediate survival, and this mode is terrible for financial decision-making. Stress narrows attention, making it harder to consider multiple factors and long-term consequences. It increases risk aversion for gains, while paradoxically increasing risk seeking for losses. It impairs the prefrontal cortex, where careful reasoning happens, while amplifying the amygdala. Where emotional reactions originate in short stress, makes you exactly the kind of decision maker who loses money in markets. Reactive, short-sighted, emotionally driven, and this creates a vicious cycle because financial problems create stress, and stress creates worse financial decisions, which create more financial problems. The research shows that people under financial stress make significantly worse financial decisions than the same people when not stressed. This is not about intelligence or education. It is about the physiological effects of stress on cognition and judgment. The person who learns to manage stress has a significant advantage in financial decision-making, not because they are smarter, but because their brain is operating in a mode that allows smart decisions to be made. This might mean developing stress management practices that keep the nervous system regulated. It might mean building enough financial buffer that minor problems do not trigger stress responses. It might mean creating decision processes that prevent action during stress states, building in delays and cooling off periods that allow stress to dissipate before important choices are made. The goal is not to eliminate stress, which is impossible, but to prevent stress states from driving financial behavior. And this requires both the self-awareness to recognize when you are stressed and the discipline to defer decisions until you are not, because the decision you make while stressed is almost never the decision you would make while calm. And the calm decision is almost always better. Topic: Sleep and wealth. Decisions. Sleep deprivation impairs judgment in ways that are remarkably similar to alcohol intoxication. Yet people who would never make important decisions while drunk routinely make them while exhausted. The research is clear: lack of sleep reduces impulse control, increases risk-taking, impairs the ability to recognize patterns and consequences, and makes people more susceptible to cognitive biases of all kinds. A night of poor sleep can measurably worsen decision quality the next day, and chronic sleep deprivation creates a persistent impairment that accumulates over time. This has direct implications for financial decision-making. The sleep-deprived investor is more likely to make impulsive trades, more likely to take inappropriate risks, more likely to miss important information, more likely to be swayed by emotions and biases. They are literally operating with a diminished brain, trying to navigate complex financial decisions with reduced cognitive capacity. And they often do not even realize it, because one of the effects of sleep deprivation is impaired ability to recognize impairment. The person protecting their financial future takes sleep seriously, not as indulgence, but as infrastructure. They understand that the best financial strategy in the world will produce poor results if executed by a brain running on inadequate sleep. They prioritize rest, especially before important financial decisions. They avoid making consequential choices when exhausted. They recognize that their judgment at midnight after a long day is not trustworthy, and they defer to their morning self, who has the cognitive resources to think clearly. This is not about being lazy or unproductive. It is about recognizing that productivity and good judgment require adequate rest, and that the time invested in sleep pays returns through better decisions in every domain of life, including and especially financial decisions, where the stakes compound over decades. Topic: the simplicity principle. Complexity feels sophisticated, and simplicity feels unsophisticated, which is backwards. The sophisticated insight is that simplicity usually outperforms complexity in financial matters because complexity creates costs, both obvious and hidden, that eat into returns. Consider investment strategies. The complex strategies with many moving parts and frequent adjustments and sophisticated instruments almost always underperform simpler strategies. Over long periods, the reasons are multiple. Complex strategies have higher fees, require more attention, create more opportunities for error, and are harder to stick with through difficult periods. Simple strategies have lower costs, require less maintenance, are more robust to mistakes, and are easier to follow consistently through market cycles. The same pattern appears throughout financial life. The complex debt structure costs more than the simple one. The complex insurance arrangement has more gaps than the straightforward policy. The complex estate plan creates more problems than it solves. The complexity premium goes to the people selling complexity, not to the people buying it, yet people keep choosing complexity because it feels like they are doing more, because simple solutions seem too easy to be effective, because the financial industry has powerful incentives to promote complexity, which generates fees and creates confusion that benefits those selling advice and products. The wealthy have often learned to resist the pull of complexity, to seek the simplest solution that meets their actual needs, to be suspicious of anything that requires elaborate explanation, to require that additional complexity justify itself through clear benefits that exceed its clear costs. They have learned that the appearance of sophistication is not sophistication, and that true sophistication often lies in recognizing that simple approaches outperform complex ones for reasons that are not obvious until you have watched both operate over time. Topic: patience as prediction. If you want to predict someone's financial future, one of the best indicators is their capacity for patience. Studies have tracked this from childhood. The famous marshmallow experiments showed that children who could delay gratification for a larger reward went on to have better life outcomes across many dimensions, including financial ones. This is not because patience is magically rewarded, but because patience is required for nearly every strategy that builds wealth. You must be patient to let compound interest work, to hold investments through volatility to build skills that increase earning power, to resist consumption that depletes resources. Patience is the common factor in almost every path to financial success, and impatience is the common factor in almost every path to financial failure. The relationship is so strong that patience might be the single most important financial skill, more important than investing knowledge or earning power or even intelligence, because all of those can be defeated by impatience, but patience can compensate for deficits in all of them. The patient person with modest income will usually outperform the impatient person with high income. The patient investor with simple strategies will usually outperform the impatient investor with sophisticated ones. Patience is the multiplier that amplifies everything else. But patience is not simply a character trait. You either have or do not have. It can be developed like a muscle. It can be strengthened through practice, protected through environment, supported through systems that make patience easier and impatience harder. The person who understands this invests in their capacity for patience. Deliberately, they practice waiting. They build delays into their decision processes. They surround themselves with patient people. They create friction between impulse and action. They treat their patience not as fixed, but as a resource to be cultivated and protected, because they understand that protecting their patience is protecting their financial future. Topic: Trust and financial relationships. Every financial relationship requires trust, and trust requires vulnerability, which creates one of the fundamental tensions in financial life. You cannot build wealth entirely alone. You need banks and brokers and advisors and partners and employees, and each of these relationships requires you to trust someone with something valuable. Yet trust is regularly violated. Financial fraud is common, conflicts of interest are everywhere, and the consequences of misplaced trust can be devastating. How do you navigate this terrain where trust is both necessary and dangerous? The answer lies in understanding what trust actually means and how it functions in financial contexts. Trust is not binary, not a simple yes or no, but exists on a spectrum and varies across dimensions. You might trust someone's competence but not their integrity, their intentions but not their judgment, their loyalty but not their skill. Understanding these distinctions allows more nuanced decisions about which relationships to enter and how to structure them. The sophisticated approach to financial relationships involves building in verification and accountability, not because you assume bad faith, but because well-designed structures align incentives and make trustworthiness easier. You verify not because you distrust, but because verification removes the burden of requiring trust. You create accountability not because you expect problems, but because accountability prevents them. You diversify relationships not because any single one will fail, but because concentration creates vulnerability. The person who extends trust wisely, neither too much nor too little, who structures relationships to minimize vulnerability while maximizing benefit, who understands that trust must be earned over time through demonstrated trustworthiness. This person can access the benefits of financial relationships while managing their risks. And this balance is essential because no one achieves financial success entirely through their own efforts. Everyone relies on others, and the skill of managing those relationships is one of the most important and least discussed aspects of building and preserving wealth. Topic: The quiet path. The most reliable path to wealth is also the most boring. You earn money through work, you spend less than you earn. You invest the difference in diversified assets. You wait for decades. You do this over and over, regardless of what markets do, or what your neighbors are doing, or what exciting opportunities present themselves. This is the quiet path, and it works with almost mechanical reliability. Yet almost no one follows it because it offers none of the psychological rewards that make activities sustainable. There is no excitement, no story to tell, no sense of beating the system, no drama to engage with the quiet path. feels like giving up on the dream of something more, and so people pursue alternatives. They seek the investment that will deliver outsized returns, the business opportunity that will accelerate their timeline, the strategy that will let them win bigger and faster than boring diversification allows. And occasionally someone succeeds with these approaches, which creates survivorship bias that attracts more people to try making the quiet path seem even less appealing by comparison. But the statistics are unambiguous. The vast majority of people who achieve lasting wealth do so through the quiet path. The flashy alternatives mostly transfer wealth from hopeful participants to those selling the hope. The quiet path is not just one option among many. It is the only option that reliably works over long periods for ordinary people, without extraordinary luck or skill. The psychological challenge is accepting this, finding a way to stay engaged with a process that offers so little stimulation, maintaining motivation through decades of repetitive behavior that generates wealth so slowly you can barely perceive it happening. This is the real work of wealth building, not finding better strategies, but developing the capacity to follow boring strategies consistently over time. And this capacity is what separates those who build wealth from those who spend their lives searching for shortcuts that do not exist. Topic: Financial goal, psychology. Goals shape behavior, but the relationship between goals and financial outcomes is more complex than it appears. Some goals help and some hurt, and the difference often lies in how the goals are structured and how they interact with human psychology. Vague goals like wanting to be rich or hoping to retire comfortably provide little guidance and generate little motivation. Specific goals, like accumulating a particular amount by a particular date, provide direction and make progress measurable, but even specific goals can backfire if they create rigidity that prevents adaptation, or if they focus on outcomes you cannot control rather than behaviors you can. The research suggests that process goals often outperform outcome goals in financial contexts. The goal to save a certain percentage of income every month is more effective than the goal to have a certain net worth by a certain age, because the process goal directs attention to behaviors within your control, while the outcome goal depends on factors you cannot influence, like market returns and economic conditions. When your goal depends on uncontrollable factors, you are setting yourself up for frustration and potential abandonment of the goal entirely. When your goal depends only on your own behavior, you maintain agency and can achieve it regardless of external circumstances. The sophisticated goal setter creates multiple types of goals at multiple time horizons. Long-term direction-setting goals that provide meaning and motivation, medium-term milestone goals that create accountability and measure progress, short-term behavior goals that direct daily and weekly action. They understand that goals are tools, not commandments, that a goal which no longer serves you should be modified or abandoned. That the point is not to achieve goals, but to become the person who achieves goals, and that person is shaped more by consistent behavior than by occasional achievements. Topic: Anchors of stability. When markets crash, when economic uncertainty spikes, when financial panic spreads through populations, what determines who maintains composure and who loses it? The answer often lies in what researchers call anchors of stability, the aspects of life that remain solid when financial ground is shaking. For some people, this might be relationships that provide support regardless of net worth for others. It might be work that gives meaning beyond its compensation for others. It might be spiritual or philosophical frameworks that place money in larger context for others. It might be health and physical capacity that remain intact, regardless of what happens to portfolios. These anchors serve crucial psychological functions. During financial stress, they prevent the complete identification of self with net worth. That makes market declines feel like personal dissolution. They provide reasons to continue when financial motivation falters. They create resilience that allows recovery from setbacks that would otherwise be devastating. The person with strong anchors can watch their portfolio decline 50% and still function, still make reasonable decisions, still maintain perspective because their entire identity is not invested in that portfolio. They have other sources of meaning and worth and security that remain intact. The person without anchors experiences the same decline as an existential threat and responds accordingly with panic and desperation and decisions driven by terror rather than reason. Building these anchors is financial work. Even though it does not appear on any balance sheet, it is the psychological infrastructure that allows financial infrastructure to function. It is what prevents temporary setbacks from becoming permanent defeats. What enables the long-term thinking that wealth requires. What keeps you in the game when everything tells you to quit. This is why the wisest financial advice often does not sound like financial advice at all. It sounds like advice about relationships and meaning and health and purpose, because these are not separate from financial success. They are the foundation on which financial success is built. Topic: the mathematics of enough. There is a number that represents your enough. The amount of money that would fund the life you actually want to live, not the life society tells you to want. Not the life your ego imagines, but the actual life that would make you happy and fulfilled. This number is smaller than most people think. Because most people have not done the work to separate genuine desires from manufactured ones. They have absorbed messages about what success looks like from media and advertising and social comparison, and these messages inflate the number far beyond what authentic happiness requires. The person who has found their enough has achieved something more valuable than any amount of additional wealth. They have escaped the trap of endless accumulation, the exhausting race that has no finish line. They can work because they want to, not because they have to. They can take risks because they have margin, not because they are desperate. They can give generously because they have surplus, not scarcity finding. Your enough requires honest examination of what actually makes you happy, which is harder than it sounds, because we often confuse what we think should make us happy with what actually does. The research consistently shows that beyond a certain threshold of material security, additional money contributes little to well-being, while time and relationships and meaning contribute enormously. But our culture screams the opposite message constantly, and breaking free of that messaging requires deliberate effort. The calculation of enough is not just mathematical, it is philosophical. What do you value? What kind of life do you want? What trade-offs are you willing to make? These questions do not have objective answers. They require introspection and experimentation and willingness to revise as you learn more about yourself. But the person who has answered them, even tentatively, even imperfectly, has an enormous advantage over the person who has never asked, because they know what they are working toward, and they will know when they have arrived. Topic: the weight of options. Money creates options, and options feel like freedom, but options also create weight. Every option you have is an option you must manage, must consider, must decide about. And this management has costs that are rarely acknowledged. The person with many investment choices must think about those choices. The person with many possible purchases must evaluate those possibilities. The person with many potential paths must contemplate which path to take. Options demand attention, and attention is finite. So more options can actually reduce, rather than increase, well-being. This is the paradox of financial success. The very wealth that creates options also creates the burden of managing those options. The millionaire must think about things the person of modest means never considers, must make decisions that never arise for those without resources, must spend cognitive and emotional energy navigating a more complex financial landscape. This is not to say wealth is bad, but to recognize that it is not purely good either, that it comes with costs that are real, even if they are not the kind of costs that generate sympathy. The sophisticated wealthy person manages option weight deliberately. They close off possibilities intentionally to reduce the burden of infinite choice. They commit to paths in ways that eliminate alternatives. They simplify even when they could afford complexity, because they understand that simplicity preserves the mental and emotional resources that make life enjoyable. They have learned that freedom is not maximized by maximizing options, but by having the right options and few enough of them that choosing does not become exhausting. The goal is not to minimize wealth, but to optimize its relationship to well-being, which often means constraints and boundaries, and deliberate limitations on what you will consider and pursue. Topic: invisible costs. Every financial choice has costs you can see and costs you cannot. The visible costs are obvious prices and fees and taxes and payments. The invisible costs are harder to perceive. Opportunity costs, what you could have done with the resources instead. Time costs, the hours spent managing and maintaining attention costs, the mental space occupied by ownership relationship. Costs, the effects on connections with others' identity. Costs, the ways possessions shape who you become. These invisible costs often exceed the visible ones, but they rarely factor into financial decisions because they do not appear on any statement or receipt. Consider home ownership, which is widely promoted as an unambiguous good. The visible costs are mortgage payments, taxes, insurance, maintenance. The invisible costs include reduced mobility as you become anchored to a location, reduced flexibility as your financial resources are locked in property, reduced time as you manage and maintain your dwelling, reduced peace of mind as you worry about values and repairs, and all the things that can go wrong. The visible costs might be worth paying, but only if the invisible costs are also worth paying, and most people never calculate the invisible costs at all. Consider career choices that prioritize income. The visible benefit is more money. The invisible costs might include time away from family stress that damages health, meaning sacrifice for compensation, identity distortion, as you become what you do for money. Again, these costs might be worth paying, but they should at least be acknowledged and weighed. The wealthy person who maintains well-being has usually learned to count invisible costs to include them in decisions, even though they resist quantification, to recognize that the cheapest option in visible terms is often expensive in invisible terms, and vice versa. This accounting is not precise. It cannot be, but even imprecise acknowledgement of invisible costs improves decisions over the alternative of ignoring them entirely. Topic: Risk reality. Most people misunderstand risk in financial contexts. They think of risk as the possibility of loss, and they think of safe investments as those unlikely to lose money. But this understanding is incomplete because it ignores the risk of not having enough, the risk of inflation eroding purchasing power, the risk of outliving your resources, the risk of missing opportunities, the risk of excessive caution. These risks are real and significant, but they do not feel like risks because they manifest slowly, gradually, invisibly, rather than in sudden dramatic losses. The cash sitting in a savings account, losing value to inflation every year, does not feel risky. But it is the bond portfolio that cannot keep pace with rising costs. Does not feel risky, but it is the person who never invests, because they fear loss may face the larger loss of never building the wealth they need. These invisible risks often exceed the visible ones, but they do not trigger the same psychological alarm bells. True financial sophistication involves expanding the concept of risk beyond immediate loss, to include all the ways financial strategies can fail. This expanded view often leads to conclusions that feel counterintuitive. Taking more investment risk might actually reduce life risk. If the alternative is certain shortfall volatility that feels dangerous, might be safer than stability that guarantees inadequate returns. The path that feels secure might be the path that leads to insecurity. This is not an argument for recklessness, but for accurate risk assessment that includes all risks, not just the ones that are psychologically salient. The goal is to take appropriate risk for your situation, which requires understanding what risk actually means, not what it feels like. And these are very different things. Topic: Generosity dynamics. The relationship between wealth and generosity is more complex than it appears. Some research suggests that wealth actually reduces generosity as a percentage of income, that the wealthy give less proportionally than those with less. This might seem like a moral failing, but it also reflects psychological dynamics that affect everyone. As wealth increases the distances between yourself and those in need, tend to increase your social circle becomes more affluent, your daily experiences less connected to struggle, your awareness of hardship more abstract and distant empathy, which drives generosity depends on connection, and wealth can reduce connection, insulating you in environments where everyone is comfortable, where need is invisible, where giving is abstract rather than personal. The person who wants to remain generous as wealth grows must actively resist these dynamics, must deliberately maintain connection to need, must create systems that ensure giving happens, even when psychological distance would otherwise prevent it. This might mean regular exposure to those less fortunate, not as charity tourism, but as genuine relationship. It might mean automatic giving that happens. Regardless of emotional state, it might mean involvement with causes that keep need visible and present. It might mean community with others who value generosity and hold each other accountable. Generosity is not just about having resources to give, it is about maintaining the psychological orientation that wants to give, and that orientation is shaped by environment and habit and attention. The wealthy person who remains generous has usually structured their life in ways that prevent wealth from corroding their connection to others, their awareness of need, their impulse to help. Topic: Legacy thinking. At some point, wealth building shifts from personal accumulation to consideration of legacy. What will happen to these resources after you are gone? Who will benefit? How will your values be transmitted? What mark will you leave this shift? Changes financial psychology in significant ways. It introduces longer time horizons, different priorities, different relationships with risk and spending. The person thinking about legacy makes different decisions than the person thinking only about their own lifetime, and these differences can be positive, creating more patience and more purpose, but they can also be complicated, creating family conflicts and control dynamics and burdens that masquerade as gifts. The psychology of legacy is not simple. Leaving wealth to children, for example, sounds straightforward but can produce unexpected effects: entitlement, dependency, conflict, inability to develop one's own capacity for earning. Some families find that inherited wealth destroys more than it builds, that the gift becomes a curse, that the attempt to help harms the most sophisticated legacy. Thinking recognizes these dangers and plans around them. It might involve structures that provide support without removing incentive trusts, that distribute based on behavior foundations that involve heirs in giving delayed inheritances, that allow recipients to develop their own capacities. First, there is no single right answer because families differ and circumstances vary. But there are clearly wrong answers, and they usually involve failing to consider the psychological effects of transferred wealth on those receiving it. Legacy is not just about resources. It is about values and wisdom and ways of relating to money that took a lifetime to develop. How do you transmit these intangibles along with the tangible assets? This is the deeper challenge of legacy planning, and it requires starting early while you can still model and teach and influence, rather than waiting until estate documents are the only vehicle for transmission. Topic: The final integration. Everything we have explored circles back to a single insight. Wealth is primarily psychological, not financial. The external numbers matter far less than the internal relationship you have with those numbers. Two people with identical net worth can live in entirely different financial realities, one in abundance and freedom, the other in scarcity and constraint, because their psychology determines their experience, not their balance sheet. This is both liberating and demanding. Liberating because it means financial well-being is available at many levels of wealth, not just at the highest. Demanding because it means external achievement alone will never produce the experience of wealth. You must do the internal work as well. What does this internal work involve? It involves examining the beliefs about money you absorbed in childhood and deciding which still serve you. It involves developing awareness of the cognitive biases that distort financial judgment and building systems to compensate it. It involves cultivating the patience and discipline that wealth requires, while maintaining the flexibility to adapt it. It involves finding your enough and organizing your financial life around it. It involves building anchors of stability that keep you grounded when financial storms hit. It involves maintaining relationships and meaning and health alongside wealth so that you have something worth being wealthy. For this work is never complete, because you are never complete. You change and grow and face new challenges, and the psychological work must continue along with you. But the work itself is the point, not some final state of achievement. It is the ongoing practice of relating wisely to money that constitutes financial well-being, not any particular level of wealth you might attain. Topic: The sleep that builds. As you rest tonight, your mind will process what you have encountered not with effort, but with the quiet efficiency of sleep. The insights that resonated will find their places in memory. The concepts that challenged will become more familiar through unconscious review. This is how learning works, not through force, but through exposure and rest and gradual integration. You do not need to remember everything. You do not need to act on anything immediately. You simply need to allow what you have heard to settle into the deeper layers of understanding where it will inform future choices, without demanding immediate change. The psychology of wealth is not a problem to be solved, but a relationship to be developed over time. You began developing this relationship before you could speak, and you will continue developing it for the rest of your life. What matters is not mastery, but direction, not perfection, but improvement. Not knowing everything, but remaining curious and open to learning. The fact that you have spent these hours exploring these ideas suggests something about your direction. It suggests attention to matters that many ignore. It suggests willingness to examine assumptions that most never question. It suggests the kind of patient engagement that wealth psychology rewards. Whatever your current financial situation, whatever challenges you face, whatever goals you hold, these hours represent an investment in the psychological infrastructure that makes financial success possible and sustainable and meaningful. The return on this investment will not appear on any statement, but it will manifest in decisions slightly better, calibrated in patience, slightly more developed in awareness, slightly more attuned to the dynamics that shape financial life. And these slight improvements compound over time, just as financial returns compound, producing outcomes that far exceed what any single moment of improvement might suggest. So rest now, let your mind do its quiet work. Let the concepts integrate and connect. Let the insights settle into wisdom, and when you wake, you will be slightly different, slightly more equipped, slightly further along the path that leads toward not just wealth, but the capacity to enjoy and use and share wealth wisely, which is the only kind of wealth worth building. Topic: Continuing currents. The ideas we have explored do not end. They continue like currents beneath the surface of daily life. The wealth thermostat keeps operating whether you notice it or not. Loss aversion keeps shaping your judgments about risk. The herd keeps pulling you toward its consensus. The sunk costs keep anchoring you to past decisions. Awareness does not eliminate these forces, but it creates space between the force and your response. It allows you to notice when the thermostat is pulling you back, to check if the loss aversion is distorting your perception, to question whether the herd is leading somewhere wise, to ask if the sunk costs deserve continued investment. This space is everything in that space, lives your freedom to choose differently than your automatic programming would choose. And freedom exercised repeatedly becomes habit, becomes character, becomes a new kind of automatic that serves you better than the old kind. This transformation is gradual. So gradual you might not notice it happening, but it is happening every time you pause before a financial decision and ask what bias might be operating here. Every time you resist an impulse purchase, by imagining your future self, every time you hold an investment through volatility that previously would have panicked you into selling, these moments accumulate. They compound just like money compounds, and eventually you look back and realize you have become someone different. Someone whose relationship with money has fundamentally shifted, not through dramatic transformation, but through countless small choices that pointed in the same direction. The current continues carrying you forward, and the only question is whether you will flow with awareness or without it, whether you will notice the dynamics at play or remain unconscious of them. And the answer to that question shapes not just your wealth, but your experience of whatever wealth you build. Topic: Night thoughts. In the quiet hours when the day's demands have faded, there is space for a different kind of thinking, slower, less urgent, more open to possibility. This is the space where real change begins, not in the frantic activity of day, but in the reflective stillness of night. You might find yourself wondering what it would mean to truly integrate what you have learned, not as abstract knowledge, but as lived practice. What would your financial life look like if the wealth thermostat were set to a different temperature? What would your decisions look like if loss aversion lost its grip? What would your portfolio look like if the disposition effect reversed itself? These are not questions that require immediate answers. They are invitations to imagination, to trying on different ways of being with money, to feeling what it might feel like to operate from different psychological foundations. The imagining itself is valuable. It creates templates for future behavior. It opens neural pathways that make new patterns possible. It begins the work of change before any external action is taken. So as you drift toward sleep, let these questions float through your mind without urgency. Let the possibilities present themselves without evaluation. Let your imagination explore financial futures that your current psychology might not believe possible. The boundaries you perceive around what is possible for you financially are largely psychological, and psychological boundaries can shift. They are not fixed like the laws of physics. They are more like habits, like beliefs, like assumptions that feel solid until they suddenly do not. And the exploration of what lies beyond them, even in imagination, even in the liminal space between waking and sleep, is part of how they begin to dissolve. Topic: Tomorrow's architecture. When you wake, the world will present its usual demands, its usual stimulations, its usual invitations to react without reflection. But something will be different. Some new awareness will persist. Some new frame will be available. Some new option for response will have emerged. This is how transformation works, not through dramatic epiphany, but through gradual accumulation of slightly different perspectives. Each one building on the last, each one making the next one possible. The architecture of your tomorrow is being shaped right now in the processing. Your sleeping mind will do in the connections it will form in the integration of new understanding with existing knowledge. You do not need to force this process. You cannot force it any more than you can force a seed to grow. But you can create conditions that allow it to happen naturally, and you have created those conditions simply by being here, simply by exposing yourself to these ideas, simply by allowing your attention to rest on these concepts long enough for them to take root tomorrow. You might make one decision differently because of tonight, one small choice that reflects a new understanding, and that small choice will set in motion consequences that cascade forward in time, affecting other choices, influencing other outcomes, shaping a future that would not have existed. Otherwise, this is the power of psychological change. It does not require external circumstances to shift it, only requires internal orientation to adjust. And that adjustment begins in moments like this, quiet moments of receptive attention, where ideas can slip past the usual defenses and find their way to the places where they can do their work. Topic: The wealth within. The deepest secret of wealth psychology is that wealth is not something you pursue. It is something you become. The external manifestations, the numbers, the assets, the options, these are symptoms of an internal state. Not causes of it. Chase the external and it recedes. Remain anchored in the internal and the external follows. This sounds mystical, but it is practical. The person who has developed the psychological foundations we have discussed, patience, discipline, awareness, equanimity, this person will build wealth almost inevitably, because everything they do will be oriented toward it naturally, without strain, without the exhausting effort of fighting against their own psychology. The person without these foundations can have wealth handed to them and watch it disappear because nothing inside them can hold it. The foundations must be built first. Everything else follows from them. This is why the quietest, most successful wealth builders rarely talk about money. They talk about habits, about character, about values, about ways of seeing and being that happen to produce wealth as a side effect, but could not be reduced to wealth as a goal. The wealth is real, but it is almost incidental to a larger project of becoming a certain kind of person. And that project is available to everyone, regardless of their current net worth, regardless of their starting point, regardless of circumstances that might seem to preclude financial success. Because the project begins internally, and internal territory is always accessible, always workable, always capable of development, no matter what is happening externally. Topic: Drifting toward dawn. The night deepens, and your awareness softens. The ideas that filled your mind begin to dissolve into something less distinct, less verbal, more diffuse. This is not loss, but transformation, the explicit becoming implicit, the conscious becoming unconscious, the herd becoming integrated. You do not need to hold on to anything. You do not need to remember everything. You simply need to allow the process to unfold, as it will, trusting that what needs to be retained will be retained, and what can be released will be released. The mind is remarkably good at this kind of filtering, at determining what matters and preserving it, at finding connections and forming patterns, at building the structures of understanding that will support future thought and action. Your job is simply to rest, to allow to surrender the effort of attention that you have sustained, and let sleep do its work. The hours of listening were the planting. The sleep is the growing, and the growth happens without your involvement, without your awareness, without any effort at all. You have done your part now. Let the deeper processes do theirs, and when you wake, whatever needs to be, there will be there ready to inform and guide and support whatever financial decisions lie ahead, whatever challenges present themselves, whatever opportunities emerge. The preparation is complete, the foundation is laid. The rest is simply living and discovering what becomes possible when psychological infrastructure supports financial life, rather than undermining it. Topic: the continuing journey. This exploration ends, but your journey continues tomorrow and the next day, and all the days after. You will encounter financial decisions, large and small, and each one will be an opportunity to practice what you have learned, to notice biases operating, to pause before reacting, to choose. Rather than simply respond, some of these opportunities you will take, and some you will miss. You will make decisions you later regret, and decisions that turn out better than expected. This is not failure. It is the normal texture of a life engaged with money, which is to say, engage with the material conditions of existence in a complex world. There is no final mastery, only ongoing practice. Only the gradual accumulation of wisdom through experience. Only the slow transformation of understanding into behavior, into habit, into character. The people who successfully build wealth and successfully enjoy that wealth are not those who achieved some perfect state of financial enlightenment. They are those who committed to the practice, who kept showing up, who learned from mistakes without being destroyed by them, who maintained curiosity and humility in the face of a domain that rewards both. This is the invitation that has been extended to you tonight, not to become perfect, but to become engaged, not to achieve mastery, but to commit to practice, not to transform all at once, but to begin the slow, patient work of transformation that continues for a lifetime. The invitation remains open regardless of what you do next, regardless of how much you remember, regardless of whether you ever return to these ideas explicitly. They will work in you anyway once introduced, because that is how ideas work. They propagate, they connect, they influence, they become part of the larger ecology of thought that shapes everything you do. So rest now and trust that the work continues, even in rest, especially in rest, and that tomorrow brings not an ending, but a continuation of something that began long before tonight and will continue long after. Topic: the mechanics of wanting. What you want is not what you think you want. The desires that drive financial behavior are rarely the desires you would articulate if asked. You might say you want financial security, but beneath that surface, want lies something else. Perhaps the desire to never feel the fear you felt as a child when money was uncertain. Perhaps the desire to prove something to someone who doubted you. Perhaps the desire to be seen as successful by those whose opinions matter to you. These deeper wants are the real engines of financial behavior, and they often operate invisibly, driving decisions that make no sense from a purely financial perspective, but make perfect sense as attempts to meet needs that have nothing to do with money. The person who buys the expensive car is not really buying transportation. They are buying identity, buying status, buying the feeling of having arrived somewhere that matters to them. The person who hoards money beyond any conceivable need is not really seeking security. They are trying to fill a void that money cannot fill, trying to soothe an anxiety that originated somewhere other than finances. Understanding your real wants is difficult, because they are defended, protected by layers of rationalization and self-deception that keep you from seeing what is actually driving you. But glimpses are possible in quiet moments when the usual defenses relax. You might notice the emotional charge around certain financial decisions, the disproportionate intensity that suggests something more than money is at stake. You might catch yourself in patterns that repeat despite your conscious intentions, patterns that serve some hidden purpose you have not yet identified. These glimpses are valuable because they begin the process of bringing unconscious wants into conscious awareness, where they can be examined and perhaps redirected or at least acknowledged, so they no longer run the show entirely from backstage. Topic: the comparison machine. Your brain contains a comparison machine that runs constantly, evaluating your position relative to others. This machine evolved when comparison served survival, when knowing your status in the group. helped you navigate social dynamics and access resources. But in modern environments, with exposure to thousands or millions of others through media, the comparison machine has become pathological because you are now comparing yourself to comparison sets that would have been inconceivable to your ancestors. You see the homes of the wealthy on screens, and your home seems inadequate. You see the vacations of acquaintances on social media, and your vacations seem lacking. You see the possessions and achievements and apparent happiness of people you have never met, and your own life seems somehow diminished by comparison. None of these comparisons make any sense. The people you are comparing yourself to are not your tribe. They are not your peers. They are curated images designed to provoke exactly the dissatisfaction you feel. And the dissatisfaction serves those who profit from it, driving consumption that attempts to close gaps that exist only because the comparison machine has malfunctioned. The person who finds peace with money has usually found some way to quiet the comparison machine, or at least to choose their comparisons more deliberately. They compare themselves to their past selves to see how far they have come. They compare themselves to those with less. To cultivate gratitude, they compare themselves to their own values and goals. Rather than to external standards set by others, they recognize that the machine will keep running because that is what machines do, but they have learned to disregard its output when that output does not serve them. This is not easy because the comparison machine is loud and its outputs feel meaningful. They feel like important information about your position in the world. But they are not, they are artifacts of a mismatch between evolved psychology and modern environment, and treating them as meaningful only perpetuates suffering that serves no one except those selling solutions to problems they helped create. Topic: Velocity and direction. In financial life, we often focus on velocity. How fast are we moving? How quickly are assets growing? How rapidly is income increasing? But velocity without direction is just motion without meaning. You can move very fast and end up nowhere you wanted to be. If you were never clear about where you wanted to go, the person who earns and spends rapidly might feel like they are making progress because there is so much activity, so much flow, so much happening. But if the flow does not accumulate in anything lasting, they are running in place, expending energy without building anything. Direction matters more than speed, and direction requires clarity about destination. What are you actually trying to achieve? What does the end state look like? How will you know when you have arrived? These questions sound simple, but they are surprisingly hard to answer because they require self-knowledge that most people have not developed. They require separating what you truly want from what you have been told to want. What actually matters from what seems to matter based on comparison and convention. The person who slows down to establish direction often ends up far ahead of the person who maintains high velocity in random directions, because even slow, consistent movement toward a clear destination will eventually arrive, while fast, chaotic movement leads only to exhaustion. The financial world celebrates velocity, celebrates growth, celebrates speed, but wisdom often lies in the opposite direction, in slowing down, in becoming clear, in choosing direction carefully, and then moving at whatever pace is sustainable, knowing that the destination matters infinitely more than how quickly you reach it. Topic: The relationship between earning and deserving. Somewhere you absorbed a belief about the relationship between earning and deserving. Perhaps you believe that what you earn reflects what you deserve, that the market accurately prices your value, that wealth is distributed according to merit, or perhaps you believe the opposite, that earnings are arbitrary, that merit and reward are unconnected, that what you receive has nothing to do with what you deserve. These beliefs shape financial psychology in profound ways. The person who believes earning equals deserving will interpret their financial position as a judgment on their worth. If they earn little, they must deserve little, which attacks their self-regard. If they earn much, they must deserve much, which inflates it. Either way, their identity becomes entangled with their income in ways that create vulnerability and distortion. The person who believes earning and deserving are unconnected might escape this trap, but might also lose motivation. Why work hard if rewards are arbitrary? Why develop skills if the market does not value them accurately? Neither belief is entirely correct. The relationship between earning and deserving is complex, not because there is some philosophically satisfying answer that reconciles them, but because markets are imperfect mechanisms that capture some merit and miss other merit that reward some contributions, and ignore others that create winners and losers through processes that are neither fully fair nor fully random. The wise financial psychology holds this complexity without collapsing into either extreme. It works hard and develops skills because these things matter, while also recognizing that they do not determine outcomes completely. It accepts whatever it earns without interpreting that acceptance as a verdict on its worth, and it remains open to the possibility that more might come, not because it is owed, but because possibility is always present for those who remain engaged. Topic: Financial intimacy. Money is one of the last taboos. More people will discuss their sex lives than their salaries. More couples fight about money than about any other subject. More shame attaches to financial struggle than to almost any other kind. This silence around money creates isolation. People suffering financially often suffer alone. Convinced that everyone else has figured out what they have not, convinced that their struggles reflect personal failure rather than common challenges, they carry their financial stress in silence, and the stress grows heavier for being unshared. The breaking of this silence is itself a form of wealth creation. Not financial wealth, but psychological wealth. The wealth that comes from connection, from shared burden, from the recognition that you are not alone in your struggles. When people begin talking honestly about money, remarkable things happen. Shame dissolves as they discover others share their experiences. Wisdom spreads as people learn from each other's mistakes and successes. Mutual support emerges as people realize they can help each other navigate challenges none of them could face alone. This is why the financial advice industry exists, not only because people lack knowledge, but because people lack community around financial matters, and professional advice is sometimes the only context where money can be discussed openly without shame. The person who cultivates financial intimacy in their close relationships, who can talk honestly with partners and friends about money, who can admit struggles and share successes. This person has access to resources the isolated person lacks, and this access compounds over time, just as financial capital compounds, creating growing advantage for those who can overcome the taboo and speak openly about what has long been unspeakable. Topic: The energy of money. Money moves with an energy that reflects the consciousness behind it. Anxious money moves anxiously contracted, hoarded, fearful of loss and generating loss through the very actions designed to prevent it. Generous money moves generously expanding, flowing, creating value, and attracting value through the energy of its movement. This sounds mystical, but it has practical dimensions. The person who holds money with fear makes different decisions than the person who holds it with confidence. The fearful person sees threats everywhere and responds defensively, missing opportunities that the confident person recognizes and captures. The fearful person contracts while the confident person expands. And over time, these different orientations produce different outcomes. Not through any magical mechanism, but through the simple reality that psychology shapes. Perception shapes decision, and decision shapes result. The energy you bring to money is the energy money brings to you, not in some cosmic sense, but in the practical sense that your internal state determines your external choices, and your choices determine your outcomes. This does not mean you can think your way to wealth through positive thinking alone. The universe is not a vending machine that dispenses rewards for proper mental states. But it does mean that the internal and external are connected, that the relationship you have with money in your own psyche will express itself in the relationship you have with money in your life, and that working on the internal relationship is not separate from working on the external one. They are two aspects of a single process, two faces of a single coin that cannot be divided without destroying what makes it valuable. Topic: Seasons of financial life. Financial life has seasons like any life: periods of growth and periods of dormancy, periods of planting and periods of harvest, periods of accumulation, and periods of distribution. The person who expects perpetual growth misunderstands the nature of cycles and will be devastated by downturns that are actually normal, by pauses that are actually necessary, by seasons that serve essential functions in the larger pattern. There are times when income is high and wealth grows quickly, and there are times when income decreases or wealth contracts, and both are part of the complete cycle. Both serve purposes that become clear only in retrospect. There are times when the right move is aggressive expansion, and times when the right move is conservative preservation, and knowing which season you are in is essential for making decisions appropriate to your circumstances. The young person in early career is in a different season than the middle-aged person at peak earning power, who is in a different season than the retired person living off accumulated assets. Each season has its own appropriate behaviors, its own appropriate risks, its own appropriate relationship to money. What is wise in one season is foolish in another, which is why financial advice must always be contextualized, always fitted to the particular person in their particular season, rather than offered as universal truth applicable everywhere. Always understanding your season means understanding where you are in the cycle, what has come before, what is likely to come, after what this particular moment asks of you, and this understanding comes not from formula, but from reflection, not from external metrics, but from internal awareness that takes in the whole picture and discerns its pattern. Topic: The stories money tells. Every financial decision tells a story about who you are, and who you are becoming. The aggregate of your financial choices over time is a narrative, a plot that moves from somewhere to somewhere else. Through actions that reveal character, the story might be one of gradual accumulation of patience, rewarded of discipline, maintained through challenges and temptations. Or it might be a story of repeated patterns of the same mistakes made again and again, of lessons not learned and growth not achieved. The story is being written right now with every choice you make, and you are both author and character, protagonist and narrator. You decide what happens next, but you also interpret what has happened before, giving meaning to events that could be read multiple ways. The person who takes authorship seriously makes choices, deliberately aware that each one adds a sentence to the story, and that the story will eventually be complete, will eventually say something definitive about the life that produced it. This is not about performing for others, about creating a narrative that will impress them, but about creating a narrative that you can live with, that reflects values you actually hold, that moves toward an ending you can accept when it comes. What story is your financial life telling? What character is emerging through the choices you make? Is this the character you want to be the story you want to tell? If not, the next choice is always available. The next sentence can always begin to turn the narrative in a different direction. The story is not fixed until it is finished, and it is not finished yet. Topic: Sacred and profane. Throughout history, cultures have distinguished between the sacred and the profane, between what is holy and set apart and what is ordinary and worldly money. In most traditions, falls firmly on the profane side. It is dirty, worldly, corrupting, a distraction from what really matters. This framing creates problems for anyone trying to integrate financial success with spiritual or ethical life. It suggests that caring about money is itself a spiritual failure, that the person who pays attention to finances is thereby paying less attention to what matters. This framing deserves questioning, because money in itself is neutral, a tool that can serve any purpose, including purposes that are sacred and meaningful. The person who builds wealth and uses it to support causes they believe in, to help people they care about, to create freedom for work that matters, has not betrayed anything sacred. They have recruited the profane to serve sacred ends, and in doing so have dissolved the boundary that seemed to separate them. The reframe that might serve you better is not sacred versus profane, but conscious versus unconscious. Money handled unconsciously, driven by fear or greed or unexamined compulsion, is indeed problematic, but not because it is profane, because it is unconscious. The same money handled consciously, with awareness and intention in service of values. That matter becomes something different, becomes a vehicle for expressing what you most deeply believe about how life should be lived. This is available to everyone, regardless of how much money they have, because it is not about amount but about relationship, not about quantity but about quality of attention and intention. Topic: the weight you carry. Consider for a moment the weight you carry around money. The stress that accumulates in your body when financial pressure increases the tension that lives in your shoulders and your jaw and your gut. When money feels uncertain, this weight is real. It manifests physically, and it consumes energy that could be directed elsewhere. energy that could support health and relationship and creativity and all the other aspects of life that get squeezed when financial stress dominates the person who builds financial security, builds more than a number in an account. They build freedom from this weight. They create space for the body to relax, for the mind to wander, for attention to flow toward things that matter, rather than being constantly redirected toward survival. This freedom is worth much more than the money that creates it. The money is just the means, the freedom is the end, and keeping this distinction clear helps maintain proper perspective when money becomes the end in itself. When the accumulation becomes its own purpose, the point has been lost, and the freedom that should have been created is sacrificed to serve the very tool that was supposed to create it. This is one of the great inversions of financial life, when means become ends, when tools become masters, when what should serve comes to dominate. The reversal happens gradually without announcement, and the person caught in it often does not notice until they have achieved financial success and discovered that the freedom they sought has somehow disappeared, replaced by new forms of bondage that money itself created. The escape from this trap requires remembering what money is, for which is not itself, but what it enables, and organizing financial life around that purpose, rather than around the money itself. Topic: Inheritance of pattern. What your parents modeled about money you are probably repeating unless you have worked very hard to interrupt the pattern. The neural pathways laid down in childhood created templates that you now follow often without realizing that you are following anything at all. The parent who spent freely created a template for free spending. The parent who hoarded anxiously created a template for anxious hoarding. The parent who avoided financial topics created a template for avoidance. The parent who fought about money created associations between money and conflict that may still be active in your relationships today. These patterns pass between generations like genetic traits, except they pass through behavior rather than biology, through modeling and conditioning, rather than chromosomes and genes, and like genetic traits. They can be modified, but not easily, not without awareness and effort and persistence. The first step is simply seeing the pattern, recognizing the ways your financial behavior echoes what you witnessed growing up. This recognition can be uncomfortable because it means acknowledging that what feels like free choice is actually conditioned response, that your autonomous decisions are shaped by forces you did not choose. But the recognition is also liberating, because what can be seen can be changed, and what remains invisible continues to control from hiding the person who examines their inheritance of financial pattern, who traces their current behavior back to its origins in early experience, who sees clearly how the past lives on in the present. This person has options that the unconscious person does not, because awareness creates choice, and choice is the beginning of freedom. Topic: The poverty of comparison. When you compare your insides to other people's outsides, you will always lose because you are comparing full knowledge of your own struggles and doubts and fears to curated presentations of others' success. The comparison is rigged from the start. Yet we make it constantly in financial life, looking at what others have and concluding that we are falling behind, that we are not enough, that something is wrong with us. For not having achieved what they seem to have achieved, the reality beneath the surface is usually very different. The person who appears wealthy may be drowning in debt. The person who appears confident may be terrified. The person who appears to have it all figured out may be as lost as you are. We present our best faces to the world, and we encounter each other's best faces, and we compare those false presentations to our full, honest experience of ourselves. And we find ourselves wanting. This is the poverty of comparison. It makes everyone feel poor, relative to illusions that do not actually exist. It creates a race that no one can win, because the finish line keeps moving as new comparisons present themselves. The escape from this poverty requires either stopping the comparison entirely, which is very difficult, or at least adjusting for the bias, recognizing that you are not comparing, like that the full reality of others' financial lives would look very different from what you see from outside, that your own situation might look enviable to someone comparing their insides to your outside. The truth is, you do not know how you are doing compared to others. You cannot know because you do not have access to the relevant information, and pretending you do only creates suffering that serves nothing and no one. Topic: financial self-forgiveness. The mistakes you have made with money are part of your education, not evidence of your inadequacy. Everyone who has built wealth has also lost money, has made decisions they regret, has missed opportunities that seem obvious in retrospect, has behaved in ways that later embarrass them. This is not failure. It is learning, and the only people who have not made financial mistakes are those who have never engaged with money at all, which means they have not learned anything. Either the question is not whether you will make mistakes, but how you will respond to them. Will you use them as evidence against yourself, as proof that you cannot succeed, as justification for giving up? Will you let them define you, creating an identity around failure that perpetuates the very patterns that produce the mistakes? Or will you treat them as information, as feedback that helps you adjust, as tuition paid for lessons that will serve you going forward? The capacity for financial self-forgiveness is essential because without it, every setback becomes cumulative. Every mistake adds to a weight of self-criticism that eventually becomes immobilizing. The person who cannot forgive themselves stops trying because trying means risking failure, and failure has become unbearable. They contract into safety, which is really just slow decline, because safety in financial life means not taking the risks that growth requires. Forgiveness creates the space to try again, to apply what was learned, to move forward without the drag of accumulated shame. It does not mean forgetting the lessons or repeating the mistakes. It means integrating them into a larger story of growth that includes both failure and recovery, both descent and ascent, both dark chapters and the light that follows them. Topic: the future self-connection. The person you will be in 30 years depends on choices you make today. But that future person feels abstract and distant, almost like a stranger who has nothing to do with you, and so their welfare receives less weight in your decisions than it deserves. This disconnection from future self is one of the primary drivers of poor financial behavior. The person who cannot feel their future suffering cannot be motivated by the desire to prevent it. The person who cannot imagine their future joy cannot sacrifice present pleasure to create it. The bridge must be built somehow, and researchers have found ways to strengthen the future self-connection that actually change behavior. Seeing aged photographs of yourself makes you more likely to save for retirement. Writing letters to your future self increases patience, visualization. Exercises that make future scenarios vivid and concrete reduce present bias. The mechanisms vary, but the principle is consistent. The more real your future self feels to you, the more you will act in ways that serve them. This is not manipulation, it is correction for a bias that distorts good decision-making. Your future self is real, they will exist. They will experience the consequences of what you do now, and bringing them into present awareness simply gives them the voice they deserve in current choices. The person who has developed strong future self-connection experiences a kind of time dilation. Their present expands to include futures that most people cannot feel, and this expanded present supports choices that create better outcomes across the whole of life, not just in the immediate moment where most people are trapped. Topic: the gift of constraints. Freedom sounds desirable and constraint sounds limiting, but in financial life, as in many domains, constraints often produce better outcomes than freedom. The person with unlimited budget may never learn to prioritize the person with unlimited options, may never learn to commit the person with unlimited time, may never learn to act while the person who operates within limits must learn these skills simply to function at all constraints. Create necessity, and necessity creates competence. This is why those who build wealth from nothing often maintain it better than those who inherit it, because the builders developed capacities through constraint that the inheritors never had to develop. And when constraint is removed, as it eventually is, for those who build successfully, the capacities remain, while those who never face constraint never develop them. Constraints also create focus, and focus creates power. The person who can invest anywhere may never invest deeply anywhere, while the person who is limited to a few options may develop deep understanding of those options that produces superior results. The person who can buy anything may never appreciate anything, while the person who must choose carefully may appreciate deeply what they do choose. The gift is hidden inside the apparent limitation, and recognizing this gift changes the relationship to constraint from resentment to something closer to gratitude, not because suffering is good, but because the growth that emerges from limitation often could not have emerged any other way. Topic: Enough as practice. Enough is not a number, it is a practice, something you do. Rather than something you reach, the person who practices enough brings a certain quality of attention to their financial life. They notice when they have what they need, they pause to appreciate. Rather than immediately seeking more, they recognize the signals of satisfaction, rather than overriding them with conditioned wanting. This practice is counter to almost everything culture teaches, which is that more is always better. That satisfaction is a trap, that if you are not growing, you are dying. The practice of enough requires active resistance to these messages, and that resistance is exhausting, which is why most people give up and let the current carry them toward permanent dissatisfaction. But for those who persist, the practice deepens. It becomes easier to recognize enough. It becomes natural to pause at satisfaction. It becomes possible to actually enjoy what you have, rather than always leaning toward what you do not have. This is wealth in the truest sense, not the accumulation of more, but the capacity to appreciate what is already present. And this capacity is available at any level of financial achievement, is available right now, to anyone who is willing to practice it. The numbers in your account are irrelevant to this practice. What matters is the relationship you have with whatever numbers are there, and that relationship can be transformed without any external change whatsoever. The transformation happens inside, in the quality of attention you bring to your financial life, in the willingness to let enough be enough, even temporarily, even for this moment, even while also working toward more in the future. The practice and the striving can coexist, and in their coexistence, something new becomes possible, something that neither alone could produce. Topic: Money as relationship. You have a relationship with money just as surely as you have relationships with people. And this relationship has a history, has patterns, has dynamics that repeat, has wounds and growth, has moments of connection and disconnection. Like any relationship, it can be improved through attention and intention, and like any relationship, it will deteriorate if neglected. The person who treats money as just a thing to be managed misses something important, because money is never just a thing. It is a carrier of meaning, a symbol of values, a representation of exchange between self and world. The relationship you have with money reflects and shapes your relationship with life itself. How you relate to resources, to scarcity, to abundance, to giving, to receiving, to the flow of value through your experience. All of this appears in your relationship with money and can be worked on through that relationship. This framing changes things. Instead of asking, how do I get more money? You might ask, how do I improve this relationship? Instead of asking, why does money cause me stress? You might ask, what is this relationship teaching me about myself? Instead of treating financial problems as purely technical, you might recognize them as relational and apply the same approaches that help with other relationships: attention, honesty, willingness to change patterns that are not working, forgiveness. When things go wrong, the relationship with money can become a site of growth and self-knowledge, rather than just a source of stress. And the person who approaches it this way often finds that the technical problems begin to resolve themselves as the relational foundation improves. Topic: The paradox of security. The more you try to guarantee security, the more insecure you become. This is the paradox at the heart of much financial anxiety. The person who hoards against every possible threat finds new threats appearing constantly, because threat perception is not about external reality, but about internal orientation. The person who buys insurance against everything discovers that there is always something more to insure against, and the very act of insuring creates awareness of risk that was previously dormant. True security is not the absence of risk, but the presence of resilience, the capacity to handle what comes, rather than the guarantee that nothing will come. And this capacity paradoxically grows stronger when you stop trying to eliminate all risk and start developing the resources, internal and external, that allow you to navigate uncertainty. The person with modest savings and high adaptability may be more secure than the person with large savings and brittle rigidity. Because when circumstances change, and they always change the adaptable person. Adjust while the rigid person breaks. This does not mean abandon all prudent protection. It means recognize that protection has limits. That beyond a certain point, additional protection creates additional anxiety, that the goal is not zero risk, which is impossible, but appropriate risk, which requires accepting that some things cannot be controlled and developing peace with that acceptance. The paradox resolves when you stop seeking security in the wrong place and start building it in the right one inside yourself. In the qualities that persist regardless of external circumstance, in the resilience that grows stronger through challenge rather than weaker. Topic: Attention as asset. What you pay attention to grows. This is as true in financial life as anywhere else. The person who pays attention to opportunities finds more opportunities, not because they magically appear, but because attention shapes perception, and perception determines what you can see. The person who pays attention to problems finds more problems for the same reason. Attention is selective. It constructs the world you experience out of the infinite possible worlds that could be experienced, and you have some choice about what it selects. This makes attention an asset, perhaps your most important one, because it shapes what becomes possible for you. The person who invests attention in financial education sees things the uneducated person cannot see. The person who pays attention to their own patterns recognizes tendencies that the inattentive person acts out unconsciously. The person who attends to long-term consequences makes decisions that the short attention span cannot support. Attention is also limited, and everything that competes for your attention is competing with everything else. The financial media that captures your attention might be displacing attention that could go toward actual financial improvement. The worry that cycles through your mind might be consuming attention that could be invested in solutions. The comparison machine running in the background might be stealing attention from appreciation of what you have. The protection of attention becomes a financial practice, guarding it from what does not serve you, directing it toward what does. Recognizing that where attention goes, energy flows, and where energy flows, results accumulate. You cannot attend to everything, so you must choose. And the choosing is consequential in ways that compound over time into the shape of your financial life. Topic: The rhythm of accumulation. Wealth builds in rhythms, not straight lines. There are periods of rapid accumulation and periods of plateau, periods when everything seems to work, and periods when nothing does. The person who expects linear progress will be disappointed and may abandon their approach during plateaus that are actually normal, during difficult periods that are actually preparing the ground for the next surge of growth. The rhythm cannot be forced, but it can be recognized, and the recognition brings patience. The plateau is doing something you cannot see, consolidating gains, deepening foundations, preparing for what comes next. If you can trust the rhythm, even when the current phase is discouraging, you can stay in the game long enough for the next phase to arrive. The person who quits during the plateau never reaches the next surge, and they may never know how close they were. The rhythms vary between individuals. What takes one person 5 years might take another 15. And comparison of rhythms is meaningless because each person's pattern reflects their unique circumstances, opportunities, and constraints. What matters is staying engaged, maintaining the behaviors that produce results, even when results are not appearing, trusting that the rhythm will complete itself if you do not interrupt it. This trust is not blind faith. It is based on understanding that complex systems rarely produce linear outcomes, that accumulation in almost every domain follows irregular patterns, that the flat parts and the growth parts are both essential to the larger pattern, and that seeing only one or the other misses the wholeness that gives each part its meaning. Topic: The Alchemy of Patience. There is something almost magical about patience in financial contexts. The same investment, the same strategy, the same approach produces radically different outcomes depending on how long it is held. The person who sells after 1 year captures a sliver of what the person who holds for 20 years accumulates. And the difference is not linear, but exponential geometric compounding that turns modest sums into substantial wealth. But only for those who wait. The mathematics are clear, but the psychology is not. Because patience is painful, it means watching others apparently succeed faster. It means enduring periods when your approach seems to be failing. It means sitting with uncertainty when certainty would feel so much better. It means trusting a process whose results remain invisible for years or decades. This is why patience is rare and why its rewards are so large. If patience were easy, everyone would have it and its benefits would be competed away. The difficulty is what preserves the opportunity. The discomfort is what creates the premium. The alchemy happens precisely because most people cannot tolerate what patience requires, and so they exit early and leave the compounded gains to those who remain. The cultivation of patience is therefore one of the highest return investments you can make. Every increase in your capacity to wait is an increase in your capacity to benefit from processes that reward waiting. And these processes include not just financial markets, but nearly everything worthwhile: careers that compound expertise, businesses that compound reputation, relationships that compound trust, skills that compound mastery. All of these require the same patience, and all of them punish the same impatience. The person who develops patience for one domain often finds it transferring to others because the underlying capacity is the same: the ability to remain engaged with something whose payoff is delayed, the ability to trust the process when the process is not yet showing results, the ability to choose the larger later reward over the smaller sooner one. Topic: Value and price. Price is what you pay, value is what you get, and these two numbers are rarely the same. Yet most financial decisions are made primarily on price, because price is visible, obvious, easy to compare, while value is hidden, complex, difficult to assess. The person who buys the cheapest option saves money in the short term, but may receive little value, and end up paying more over time when the cheap thing fails or requires replacement. The person who pays more for genuine quality may feel the sting of the higher price, but receive value that far exceeds what they paid. This is not an argument for always paying more, because sometimes the cheap option really is the best option. The point is that price alone tells you almost nothing about whether something is worth buying. You need to understand value, and understanding value requires work. It requires research and experience and judgment that develop over time. The sophisticated financial thinker has learned to look past price to value, to ask not how much does this cost, but what am I getting for what I pay, to recognize that the same price can represent terrible value or extraordinary value depending on what is attached to it. This applies to everything from consumer purchases to investments. The stock that seems expensive based on price might be cheap based on value if the underlying business is strong enough. The stock that seems cheap based on price might be expensive based on value if the underlying business is deteriorating. Price is just a number. Value is what determines whether that number represents opportunity or trap. And the ability to distinguish between them is one of the most important skills in financial life. Topic: The compound effect of small choices. The dramatic financial decisions get attention: the big investment, the major purchase, the career change. But most financial outcomes are determined not by these dramatic moments, but by the accumulation of small choices made daily, almost without thought: the coffee purchased or not purchased, the subscription continued or canceled, the lunch brought from home or bought at a restaurant. Each of these seems inconsequential in isolation, but they compound, they accumulate, they shape the trajectory of financial life through sheer repetition. The person who makes slightly better small choices consistently will end up far ahead of the person who makes dramatic gestures occasionally. Because the small choices happen thousands of times, and the dramatic gestures happen rarely, and frequency multiplied by time produces results that dwarf what any single decision could achieve. This is both encouraging and discouraging. Encouraging because it means you do not need to make perfect big decisions. You just need to make slightly better small ones consistently. And that is achievable for almost everyone. Discouraging because it means there is no shortcut, no single decision that will transform everything, no moment of brilliance that will compensate for years of careless small choices. The work is daily, mundane, unglamorous. And that is precisely why most people do not do it. They want the dramatic transformation, the sudden shift, the decision that changes everything. And while they wait for that moment, the small choices continue compounding, taking them further from where they want to be with each passing day. The person who accepts the compound nature of small choices stops waiting for transformation and starts making today's choices slightly better than yesterday's and tomorrow's choices slightly better than today's, and trusts that this patient accumulation will produce results that no dramatic gesture ever could. Topic: the information diet. You are what you consume intellectually as surely as you are what you eat physically. And the financial information most people consume is junk food, designed to trigger emotional responses and generate engagement, rather than to inform or improve decision-making. The financial news cycle requires constant content, and constant content requires constant drama, and constant drama means treating every market fluctuation as significant, every economic report as momentous, every prediction as worth attending to. This stream of noise drowns out the signal that might actually help you make better decisions, and it activates emotional responses that lead to worse decisions. Anyone who has watched their portfolio during a market crash while consuming financial media knows how this works. The media amplifies the fear. The fear triggers the desire to act. Acting during fear typically means selling low, and the whole process transfers wealth from those who consumed the information to those who did not. The sophisticated investor manages their information diet as carefully as they manage their portfolio. They limit exposure to news that triggers. Rather than informs, they seek out sources that provide perspective. Rather than panic, they recognize that most financial information is not information at all, but entertainment disguised as information, and they protect themselves from entertainment that costs money to consume. They might check their portfolio quarterly, rather than daily, read analysis monthly, rather than hourly. Engage with financial content deliberately, rather than reactively. This is not ignorance, it is wisdom about what information actually helps and what information hurts, and the recognition that more information is not always better, that there is such a thing as too much, and that finding the right amount is essential to maintaining the equanimity that good decisions require. Topic: friction and flow. Money flows along paths of least resistance, and the shape of those paths determines where money ends up. The person who has made saving automatic has created a path of least resistance toward wealth. The money flows to savings without requiring decision, without requiring willpower, without requiring anything at all. Once the initial setup is complete, the person who must decide each month whether to save has created friction in the path, and that friction means some months. The saving will not happen because the decision will go the other way. This is why automatic enrollment in retirement plans increases participation so dramatically. Not because it changes anyone's underlying preferences, but because it changes the path of least resistance. When the default is enrollment, people enroll. When the default is non-enrollment, many people never get around to enrolling. The preference is the same, only the friction is different. The sophisticated financial architect understands friction and uses it deliberately. They create friction on paths they want to avoid, making it harder to spend impulsively, making it inconvenient to make changes during market volatility, making it difficult to access savings that should remain untouched, and they remove friction from paths they want to follow, making it easy to invest consistently, making it simple to stay the course, making the good behavior the default that happens without effort. This architecture is more important than willpower because willpower depletes and architecture persists. Willpower requires constant effort, and architecture requires only initial setup. Willpower fights against friction, and architecture redirects it. The person who relies on willpower alone will eventually fail, because everyone does, but the person who builds good architecture can succeed, even when willpower is exhausted, because the architecture keeps working regardless. Topic: the meaning of more. What does more actually mean when applied to money? More than what? More than you had before. More than you need, more than others have, more than some arbitrary target. You set the answer matters because different definitions of more produce different behaviors and different outcomes. The person pursuing more than before is on a path of continuous growth that may or may not have an endpoint. The person pursuing more than needed is on a path towards sufficiency that could theoretically be achieved. The person pursuing more than others is on a path with no possible end, because there will always be someone with more, and even if you reach the top, Someone would be coming up behind you, the person pursuing more than some target has at least defined what enough looks like and could potentially stop when they get there. Most people have not clarified what more means to them, and so they pursue it vaguely, endlessly, without ever knowing what they are actually chasing or how they would know if they caught it. This vagueness serves those who profit from perpetual consumption, because vague goals can never be achieved, can never produce the satisfaction of completion, can always be expanded to require additional effort and expenditure. The clarification of what more means to you, specifically, concretely, personally, is a radical act, because it puts a boundary around desire, because it makes enough theoretically possible, because it threatens the entire machinery of manufactured wanting. That depends on your goals remaining forever undefined.